my YouTube channel, see if it shows up.
Okay, let me do that. I'll go to my iPad here. And TJump, your primary channel, TJump.
YouTube.com/TJump.
Okay.
It says online. It says it's online now. Should be working.
TJump. And TJump, subscribe. And Daniel Ray, How Can Theists Live. And TJump, subscribe. There we are. Yep. I see it.
All right, cool. All right,
we're
it's
good.
Working now. There we go.
We're good. Let me turn it down so I don't.
Yeah, you can turn that off now. It's fine.
Okay, good. We don't need that.
Yeah.
So would you like me to start over?
Sure, go for it. Start over.
You want to go back? You'll have to hear everything again.
Yeah, that's fine. That's not.
Are you sure? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, we'll do that.
We could start at the beginning. Hi, Daniel Ray is on.
Do you want to go all the way that far back?
Well, I did probably just give the introduction. So last time we talked about how we differentiate imagination from reality, and the question that I asked you at the end of the conversation was, how can a theist differentiate imagination from reality without using science? And so you were going to give an explanation of how to do that.
Yes, I was going to give explanation through example and discussion, and hopefully that it will at least be mildly entertaining and stir up thought. That's my goal here today. Awesome. So, yeah, Tom, I know I just asked this question, but we're going to go through this again for the sake of the live broadcast on your main channel. Would you spend $10 billion to find out if this equation were true?
No.
No, you wouldn't. And probably I wouldn't either upon first guess. If somebody came to my house and I was a billionaire and they said, Ray, we want your money. We want to spend your money to figure out if this is true. Like yourself, I probably would not concede to doing that as well. But this is a very critical equation for the history of science. And it's the equation for the Higgs boson. And so to answer your question today, Tom, I have prepared some wonderful slides for testing our knowledge of reality, bosons, and belief. And the Higgs boson, as you know, was discovered in 2010, 2011, firmly announced publicly in 2012. Higgs and Francois Englert, I think it's Englert, won the Nobel Prize for Physics for their work on the Higgs boson. This is 2012. All the following information is coming from the Smithsonian Magazine of July of 2013. It's online. You can check it out. Of course, you're familiar with the Higgs idea, and I think a lot of your audience probably is as well. He first wrote a paper about it in 1964. And in a very simplistic sense, I got this from the article from Brian Greene's example. I thought it was very helpful. The Higgs field acts like water in a glass. If you put a ping pong ball in it and you push down on the ping pong ball, it's a lot harder to push than if you just tried to push the ping pong table along a table. It's much easier. And the Higgs field is what Higgs and others believed gave things their mass. So stuff goes through a field. And the Higgs is involved in giving it its mass or making it massive. Or I'm not exactly sure of the physics myself, but I thought this was a helpful analogy for those that people don't know what the Higgs field is. It's like water in that sense, very simplistically. From the excuse me, from the article, who was written by Brian Greene, who is a physicist. He says that mathematical equations sometimes tell us such a convincing tale. It's interesting he uses that language. I like it. The math tells a story. They can seemingly radiate reality so strongly that they become entrenched in the vernacular, in the vocabulary of working physicists, even before there's data to confirm what the math is saying. So last time we talked, Tom, we talked about Sean Carroll and a few other models of mathematical models of eternal cosmologies, right?
Yep.
And so like Carroll believes and others believe that the math tells them X, even though we don't have hard data on X, the math leads them in that direction. And so that's what Brian is saying. He's saying we build mathematical models, and the models are so convincing mathematically that we want to go out and we want to test them, and we want to see if there's any reality to them or not. We brought up Eugene Wigner last time we talked. He's not a Christian, but he believes that mathematics is some kind of miracle, that the language of mathematics for the formulation of laws of physics is a wonderful gift we neither understand nor deserve. And he says we should be grateful for it, but he doesn't espouse where mathematics comes from. He just believes it's incredibly useful and wonderful to the point of it being a gift or a miracle. So that $10 billion was spent on the Higgs boson investigation, and that included the building of the Large Hadron Collider, which is probably the coolest science experiment on the planet at present, maybe next to the Hubble Space Telescope. I don't know. But basically what this is, as most of you know, is that they speed up particles almost near the speed of light because they don't have enough energy to speed up things to the speed of light. So they come very close, but they spent $10 billion to build this, by and large, to discover if the Higgs field and the Higgs boson was a real thing. Now, there were other reasons for building the collider, of course, but the primary one was for the Higgs field, according to Brian Greene's article. And so the Large Hadron Collider was built, and it was a step of faith for people to spend that kind of money and to build that kind of structure to find out if that equation was really true. The math led to that kind of action. That's pretty remarkable. So some physicists really knew what this was saying and really believed that it was worth the time, money, investment, and labor to build this and to find the Higgs. And so Greene says that this is an astonishing triumph of mathematics' power to reveal the workings of the universe. And so mathematics is this wonderful conceptual language that we have that enables us and leads us to actually making discoveries about the physical world before we actually have the physical data. So this is the public announcement of the Higgs in 2012.
I'm not hearing anything. But I don't think it...
Oh, you're not hearing anything?
I don't think I need it. It's fine.
Okay, I'll move it. I'll move on. I didn't know if the video was going to be... Can you see that now?
Yep.
Okay, it was just the public announcement of the boson's discovery. Peter Higgs kind of wept a tear of joy because he waited 48 years for the confirmation of his theory, something the math told him was there. $10 billion were spent to confirm his idea. So what a joy. You know, this is half your life, more than half of your life, believing that a theory is true, despite the fact that your peers, I don't know what kind of pushback he got from people, but it wasn't widely accepted for quite some time. So he had to endure a lot of professional criticism and probably a little bit of jabbing and mockery at times as well, because the Higgs field was just an imaginary, it was like aether, you know, the medieval aether, the stuff passing through the cosmos. And so what a vindication for Dr. Higgs to have been there when they announced this. 48 years, what a relief and what joy. So my questions that come out of this, I think, how long do we have to wait for the confirmation of a hypothesis? That's a question. And then when we talk about God's existence, what's imaginary versus what is real, how does a skeptic or an atheist know what a confirmation of God's existence would look like? So if we perform a test and it comes to certain conclusions, how do the skeptical interlocutors know that they're looking at a successful test for God's existence, much like physicists know exactly what they were looking for when they were looking for the boson? So here's the boson, and there it is right there in the data. That's how it shows up between the 120 and the 130 mark there, through many statistical samplings through the collider between 2011 and 2012. Now, I wouldn't have been able to know it because I'm not a physicist. But how was this a success? They knew in advance what the boson would look like, and they acted on what they believed. They knew what they were looking for. So I think here's the problem between us, Tom. I think, or the discussion between us. I don't want to say it's a problem, but probably where we differ. For a skeptic to propose a test for God, it would require the skeptic to know before constructing the test what the evidence for God would look like, just as Peter Higgs had very specific parameters regarding the characteristics of the boson particle. So you don't spend $10 billion unless you know specifically what you're looking for. So how would a skeptic or an atheist know if any test results would positively show evidence for God? How would you test?
Just to interrupt there, the atheist wouldn't. The theist would. The theist has a hypothesis. The theist would have to make a model to test it. The atheist wouldn't have to do anything. I mean, the atheist can just ignore it until you make testable predictions. So it wouldn't be the atheist making the model. That wouldn't make any sense.
Well, no, but when you say that the model has yielded insufficient results, you are making a tacit positive claim that this didn't meet the criteria for God's existence, right?
No. I'm saying it just hasn't made any testable predictions. Like it hasn't done anything. So I'm not saying that you have a model that has worked and it's insufficient. I'm saying you don't have a model, it doesn't work, and there is no prediction at all. So it's not like I'm saying there's some evidence that's insufficient. I'm saying there is zero evidence. There's nothing.
Right. But to say there's no evidence, you have to have a set of criteria in advance to know that there's no evidence. I mean, it's a simple thing. Like
future,
if I say
future testable prediction. So the same thing that the Higgs boson thing was confirming. You need to be able to predict it and then do an experiment to confirm it.
Well, do you have to have, in order to test something, do you have to have the predictive aspect to your test?
Yes.
Is that a requirement?
Yeah. To test something, you have to make a prediction to get like a result. That's
Can you use existing information to make your hypotheses, to test your hypotheses?
Usually you always do that. I don't understand. Yes. That's what,
so that's okay to use that so how do you know that that information that you use within a test is allowable if it's not something that is being predicted? So in other words, like say how they tested for relativity. They used an existing body of knowledge of Mercury's perihelion around the sun when it was closest to the sun. They used that measurement to determine whether or not Einstein was correct. But
well, actually, they measured the curvature of light around the sun. Einstein made a novel prediction about the curvature of light around the sun. So he tested.
But they used existing data to do that. And I'm saying
that's all theories do that. So all theories, you start with ideas from the past. You start with old information. Then you build that together like Lego pieces to build a model.
Sure.
And you say this model has this new piece in it that we haven't seen before, and that makes a prediction.
Right. So you seem to be excluding a priori that there's nothing with God that we can even begin, like the perihelion of Mercury.
Well, no, I don't a priori exclude anything. So you're allowed to make up whatever you want in the model. I don't care at all. So I just say it hasn't been done yet. There's no evidence that has been presented yet. It definitely could. There's clearly possible evidence.
But I think where I'm maybe missing you is that if I say, so for example, if I've never met you, and I say, well, Tom, I see photographs of people that tell me this is what Tom looks like. And I say, well, I continue to see these photographs, but I continue to say, well, there's no evidence of Tom in these photographs. Well, how would that statement make sense unless I knew what you already looked like? Right? I could say repeatedly that, well, that's not Tom. That's not Tom. That's not Tom. There's no evidence of Tom in these pictures. There's no evidence of Tom in these pictures. That statement only makes sense if I know what TJump already looks like, right?
Well, that statement only makes sense if you'd never seen pictures before. So if there was no prior evidence to pictures existing and someone handed you a picture of me, you would just say, well, this is just a really nice painting, and you wouldn't constitute evidence for me existing.
Well, whether it's a painting or a picture, I could say, well, that's not Tom. That's not evidence of Tom's existence. But I would still,
only if you've never seen pictures before. If we have an abundance of evidence of pictures and we know pictures are taking pictures of real people who exist for the most part, then it's pretty good evidence that someone in a picture does exist.
Well, I think I'd still have to know what you'd look like to be able to say there's no evidence of your existence. I'd have to know something about, I'd have to have a predetermined knowledge about who you are, what you're like, in order to say that you don't exist.
No, you don't know. You don't have to know anything about me at all. You just know about the picture. So my constitution is irrelevant. You just say, this is a picture. And if you have no prior knowledge of pictures, no prior evidence of what a picture is, then you couldn't count that as evidence that the person in the picture existed because you don't know what the thing is.
Well, we could take pictures, we could take books, we could take your articles, we could take
just going with the pictures thing. So if you have a piece of evidence, but you've never seen this evidence before, it's not something that you know about. It doesn't have a background knowledge, doesn't have any empirical verification from the past. You just saw this first thing. There's this person holding this thing in their hand and saying, this is evidence that Tom exists. You can't count that as evidence because you've never seen it before. You don't have any background knowledge. You'd have to say, if this is evidence, I need to make some testable prediction to count this as evidence that can verify this as evidence.
Right. I would have to assume certain characteristics.
No, you assume nothing.
About
there are
TJump.
no assumptions. No assumptions here. Nothing about the person in the picture. This is just about pictures in general. You have a picture, and you want the picture to count as evidence. You need other examples of pictures counting as evidence. If you just have one picture and it's never counted as evidence before,
I began the analogy with the idea that I've been shown a bunch of pictures of you, and all I say
so there's pictures of me and there's pictures in general. If you know there are lots of pictures, like we have pictures of people all over the world, they're common. You have pictures in your house of your family and you know they exist, and you have pictures of movie stars and you know they exist, and someone shows you a picture of me that is the same as the picture of those, then that would definitely count as evidence for me because of the background evidence that pictures have already been used to count as evidence for other people existing. So here is a picture that also counts for me existing in the same way it counts as evidence for all the past people to exist. But if you present the first picture ever made to a human being and they say this is evidence for this person existing, that would not be reasonable to accept. So
I'm not doing that. I'm saying that there are an abundance of pictures of you let's just say videos, if you want, just the still frames of your videos, and I say in every one of them, that's not TJump. That's an imposter. That's somebody else. That's not Tom. I absolutely have to know what you're like to be able to say that to make,
no, you don't,
to make that make
again,
sense.
So nothing about me is relevant to that argument. You don't need to
Oh,
say
sure it
anything about
is.
me.
Sure it is.
No.
If I don't know what you look like, I can't say you don't exist.
Again, so whether or not I exist is irrelevant. You have to understand the atheist position here is that asserted evidence indicative of the conclusion that I exist? If no, then it's reasonable to conclude I'm imaginary. But there is no reason to conclude I exist. So you don't actually need to disprove the existence. That's just shifting the burden of proof fallacy, classical theist thing. They just doesn't work that way. So the only relevant premise here is, does the presented evidence indicate the conclusion, yes or no? If no, then there's nothing to conclude it's real, so it's imaginary.
So what do you make of me saying here's 15 photographs of TJump, and I say there's no evidence of him in any of these photographs?
That would just be false, because we know that photos count as evidence since we have an abundance of photos counting as evidence in the past.
But I'm saying specifically what you look like. I'm making a claim about what you look like, and I'm saying none of these photographs show what you look like. I would have to know what you're like. I would absolutely have to know what you look like for that statement to make sense.
I have no idea what you're even saying right now. So if you're just saying that doesn't even make sense. So you wouldn't be able to make a claim about a person that you don't know exists based off of a picture if you don't know if it's that person.
Exactly. We agree that I would have to know.
There's no relevance to that, to the atheist position. None.
Oh yeah, sure there is. Because I'm not saying you in this specific example. I'm saying in general, a skeptic atheist position that says that there's likely no evidence for the position.
So there's the thing. If I say there's no evidence, I've said nothing about God. So I don't need to know anything about God to say there's no evidence.
Oh yes, you do. Yes, that's the point of the analogy.
No,
I can't.
Well, no, that's the point where there is no analogy. So all I need to know is the evidence. Does evidence X indicate an existing being? That's all I need to know. I don't need to know nothing about the being. The being at all. The being is irrelevant. The qualities of the being are irrelevant. All that matters is you have to know what your being is like. You have to make predictions, and if those predictions work, it's evidence. No matter what you say your being is like, I couldn't care less. The only thing that qualifies as evidence is you made a testable prediction, and the evidence, the epistemological verification is correct. You predicted something we don't know yet. You got it right. That's evidence. So I don't need to know anything about the God. I have no idea what the God is like. That's all in your head. You could say it's a square circle. I couldn't care less. You could say it's a black box. You have an idea of what God is like. I know literally nothing about God, and you're saying you have this black box God, and it's going to make a prediction that X is going to happen and X happens. That's evidence. I need to know nothing about the God for that to be evidence.
Well, you do when you say that the evidence has not been demonstrated, or there has been no.
So again, I can prove that false right now. You have an idea of God. I know nothing about it. God is a black box. I know literally nothing. It's just your idea, and you use that idea to make a prediction that the lottery numbers next week are going to be whatever, and you get it right like multiple weeks in a row. That's evidence of whatever it is your idea of God is. I need to know literally nothing about the idea of God for that to count as evidence.
Well, how would you know if it was genuine evidence for God's existence or not?
You made
if
the
I demonstrated something to you and it came to pass, or who's determining if it actually if it came to pass, or even if it didn't come to pass, you still are making the ultimate determination of whether or not that criteria has been satisfied, right?
Nope, it's all if it works. If the predictions work, that's evidence. Doesn't matter. I need to know nothing about the God at all.
Well, sure. I mean, if you say that if I make a prediction based on X and it comes to pass and it's before you, and you say, well, is that sufficient? I say, well, is that sufficient evidence for God's existence? Well, and you would have to make a qualitative determination.
Sufficient doesn't matter. So I'm just going what is evidence? That would be evidence. That would absolutely be evidence. Sufficient would be a different question about the magnitude of the claim you're making, which I don't know anything about that. I don't know I don't know what your qualities of God are, so I can't say if it's sufficient to prove your idea of God, but I can say it's evidence. I can say, yes, that is definitely evidence for whatever it is you think is in that box.
Okay, well, let's go on. I have this analogy that may be pertinent to what we're saying. And I'm sorry for talking over you because there's kind of a delay, so I apologize.
I don't care.
I don't mean
it doesn't bother me at all.
Okay, well, I don't want to be rude. I just, sorry about that. Anyway, so this is an analogy that might be helpful. Do you know who this gentleman is?
Nope.
Okay, he's pretty famous in a quiet kind of way. This is the Pac-Man creator, software engineer Toru Iwatani, I think is how you pronounce his name. and I think we've all played Pac-Man, and I think you can get it on your phone and stuff, and it's still I grew up with it. You played Pac-Man? I'm sure, right?
Yep. And there's a
Yeah.
bug at the end. If you get to level like 255 or whatever, it breaks.
There's a what? I
There's
never got that.
Yeah, there's on the original machines, the bits on the processor is limited to
Mhm.
256, and so if you get to level 255 and you beat it, it'll crash the game.
Wow. Did you crash it?
No, I thought it was insanely boring. I never played it.
Oh, okay. Do you know anybody that ever crashed it?
Yep, I see them
Oh,
on YouTube all the time.
oh
YouTubers.
wow. People crashing Pac-Man. That's funny. Anyway, so this is an analogy. No analogy is perfect. I understand. Um, does this game count as evidence of Toru's existence? Does the game itself count as evidence of his existence?
No,
Why
not
not?
just it's existing. Because you would need prior, like again, it would be the same things. Like if you have a photo, the first photo ever, if it's just a photo, and you've never seen any other photos, then it would not be evidence of anything. You'd have to have some prior background knowledge. If you know that game exists and you know games are designed by humans and you know he's a human, then it would count as evidence if you include all of the background knowledge of what a game is, how games are made, the history, the empirical evidence, then that included in the fact here is a game would be evidence, but just the game itself is not evidence.
It's not one part of a cumulative case. You don't say it
Oh yeah,
counts
no,
as
the
evidence.
cumulative case would be fine. So you say here is a video game. We know video games are made by humans. We have lots of evidence of video games being made by humans. We know the history of this video game. We know they're made in Japan. We know the guy who made it. We have all of his background knowledge, and that cumulative case, yes, that would be good evidence. Just the game
Okay.
on its own is not. It's just a single fact. It doesn't
It's
count
one
as evidence.
part of a cumulative
No,
case.
it's a nothing on its own. It's nothing, literally nothing.
Yeah, I think we would probably disagree on that because I do think it is one part. I mean, if it's one part of a cumulative case, then there is some substantial significance to this being evidence that he is a
So for
software
example,
designer.
like if we were a pygmy tribe in the middle of Polynesia and someone
Mm.
dropped a Pac-Man machine and we played the Pac-Man and you asked this same question, the answer would be no. They know nothing about how games work. They know nothing about who designed the games. They know nothing about the history of it. They have no background knowledge. Just the existence of this game would not be evidence of anything other than this game exists. So in
Well,
order to have the connection between the game to the person, you have a hypothesis. You have here is a phenomenon we're trying to explain, and that one thing is the phenomenon. The game
but
is the phenomenon. And
the pygmy culture's ignorance of Toru does not discount the game as evidence of Toru's
well, no,
existence.
that's the thing. The game is never evidence. The game is the phenomenon. We're trying to explain the phenomenon. The phenomenon can't count as evidence for a conclusion. It's the phenomenon we're trying to explain.
Yeah, I'm trying to establish Toru's existence.
Right.
Using the game as part of the cumulative case for his existence.
Right. So
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 you
for
could
any
be
for
you could be
any hypothesis ever, you have a phenomenon you're trying to explain. You say X occurs, and so in this case, Pac-Man is the X. Now the X is evidence of nothing. You can't ever say that use the X as evidence. This is the phenomenon we're trying to explain.
that's a philosophical assumption I think we
No,
differ on
it's a
right
proof. It's a philosophical proof because of the problem of underdetermination. So for example, if I wanted to say here is like one of the common examples is objective morality. That's the one I've been talking about recently. You have
now. Yeah.
objective morality. So we observe moral intuition and moral progress, and those are the evidences that there is some moral phenomenon we're trying to explain. Now, moral intuition and moral progress isn't evidence for subjective morality or objective morality or um, Cornell realism or a god. It's just the phenomenon. So it's not evidence of any of those things. It's the phenomenon we're trying to explain. If you want to say it's evidence for one of them, you need to go more beyond that and say, if my hypothesis is true, then I can predict this new thing we don't know yet. So anything we currently know is post hoc, something we already know. But for it to count as evidence of your hypothesis, you need something novel, something new that we don't know
Well,
yet.
it would seem to me, though, Tom, the problem that you've created for yourself epistemically is now you've said that in order for this to count as evidence, we need to have additional information, which are also pieces of the puzzle. And so the epistemic quandary you've created seems to be that these pieces of the puzzle also are individualistic and also further require justification
No,
for their inclusion into a body of evidence. I think
no,
that's
no, it's the same thing. So you have past evidence, and that's all stuff we're trying to explain. And then you have, if the past evidence indicates my hypothesis, then you have future evidence, which we don't know yet. And that's the stuff that actually counts, that indicates your hypothesis is true. So the past stuff, anyone can always explain the past stuff. It's called post hoc rationalization, post hoc theorization, lots of different terms for it. All of the past data can be explained by infinitely many theories. It's not evidence of anything. If you want evidence, you have to go beyond the past data into the future data and predict something new that we don't know yet.
So I think the problem where we differ is on what counts and how you would include something that would count as evidence, which is an epistemological.
That was the original question we asked: is how do you differentiate imagination from reality if you're not using science? So post hoc rationalization cannot do this. We've already proven this. It's called post hoc theorization. We know for a fact it cannot do that. We cannot differentiate imagination from reality. That's why science requires novel testable predictions.
So you say that, so to be clear on what you mean by imaginary, can we back that up a little bit? Because I remember we talked about it briefly. What's your concept of imaginary?
Conceptual, just anything in our heads, anything we think of, anything that is just an idea.
And those ideas are not, they don't interact with this concept of what you mean by evidence?
You have no idea what that means. So
let me just try to be as simple as I can to make sure I'm understanding you properly. You've explained to me in logical definitional terms how you understand what evidence means, which for our discussion so far are just conceptual ideas. And so how does the conceptual ideas that you have enter into this discussion about what counts as evidence if what you're saying is just merely conceptual?
So we have try to explain this simply. So if I imagine a unicorn, I don't see a unicorn in front of me. If I try to lift up the TV with my mind, it doesn't move. So the ideas in my head don't seem to affect anything in the world as far as I can tell, or they don't seem to do anything. If I picked up this mug and tried to throw it at you, it would not work because my mind doesn't, I don't have force powers or whatever. So if we know that our concepts in our head do not affect the world, as far as we can tell, then if I can use my concepts to make a prediction about the world that we don't know yet, then that is good evidence that the ideas in my head correspond to something in the world, not just an idea in my head.
Yeah. Okay. So I follow you there. So let's continue on with the Pac-Man thing. How do you know that there has been no demonstration of the reality of God in the world?
You lost me. So just on the Pac-Man thing, we have.
Yeah. So here's the analogy. 2,000 years from now, what would count as evidence of Toru's existence and what he created?
Novel testable predictions, same as anything.
Okay. But unpack that though. What do you mean by how would we have a novel testable prediction about historical things that happened in the historical past? How would we would test or predict anything about history in that regard? Because I don't see how you'd bring in history into a sort of empirical setting in a laboratory like you'd look for carbon-12 or the Higgs boson. It seems like to me...
Well, it's literally the same thing, so there's no difference there at all. It's like, if Toru, for example, if imagine we're pygmies on the island, we discover a Pac-Man thing, first Pac-Man thing we've ever seen, you have a hypothesis, Toru made this Pac-Man thing. For that to be true, you'd have to say, well, if Toru made this Pac-Man thing, then I can predict that if I connect to the World Wide Web, which I also think exists or whatever, then I can find... the history of Toru and his discoveries, or I can find, or if we dissect the machine, which we haven't done yet because we don't have the technology to, all we can do is play it. If we dissect the machine, we will find in the programming, we'll find his writing where he specifically says his name, or if we beat the game, we'll find his name at the credits, or if we go to a different country, we'll find other people who can verify this claim, who will give us other resources that we can test and verify, or we'll find all these other things. There's infinitely many testable predictions we can make here that can all be confirmed, that could all count as evidence that this is true.
Well, why doesn't you could do the same thing with God?
How so?
You can go on the internet, you can talk to people, you can see it spread throughout the country, and if somebody says, "Well, I'm a Christian," you can predict
which one of those was a novel testable prediction. So in the case of we're on an island and we know nothing of the internet, we know nothing of other people, we know nothing of anything related to technology, and we see this Pac-Man thing. All of those things I said were all things we never knew. We had no idea about any of these yet. These are not things we know yet. But in our case, all of the things you listed are things we've already known for a million years. Though none of those are novel, none of those are testable, none of those are predictions. Those
Okay,
are all things we already know. So
but
in
you
the
said
case,
earlier that we can bring the past into our experiments, in our tests.
uh, so if you make a testable prediction, like if we beat the game, Toru's name is going to show up in the back of the credits or whatever, that's a future testable prediction which confirms something about the past. So we make a
Right.
future testable prediction, and that future testable prediction will then verify the past. So
So
it's I don't
a simple example would be for Christianity would be somebody who was not a Christian who investigated the Christian faith. I'm not saying this proves it. I'm not saying this is, but it has to be at least one part of a cumulative case of evidence for myself. You would expect that if somebody who has tattoos up and down his arm, who was a long-haired rock star in
no.
Los Angeles, or I wasn't a rock star or whatever, but my changed life after examining the case for Christianity, after coming to know who Jesus is, looking at the past, looking at other people's testimony.
Why would you think that was evidence of anything? Like I could say, it's evidence that someone who investigated the flat Earth came to the conclusion the Earth is flat, and that would be evidence of the flat Earth. Well, no,
I'm not,
obviously not.
no. I'm not arguing that my change is definitive
Well, no, no.
proof.
Again, I'm not
saying
saying definitive. So I'm saying that doesn't count as anything. So, for example, if I say a flat earther investigates the globe Earth and discovers it to be insufficient and converts to flat earther, based on your standard, that would be evidence the world is flat.
it would be one case in his case for that. Yes.
So
I'm
that would
not
be
saying
that
that
would
it
be
makes the case. I'm not saying that it makes the case
right,
flat.
right. I'm not
I'm
arguing.
not saying that.
Again, so
I
I'm
think we
not
agree.
arguing
I
for
think we
proof
agree.
here. I'm only saying there is no evidence. So there is nothing that adds to anything. So again, my criterion is, can you differentiate imagination from reality? And so if your criterion of some like cumulative case, if you're trying to add this up or whatever, this
Yeah.
piece can add to moving the compass towards that ability, that if a person investigates it, finds it insufficient, and converts, is somehow adding up to that. Clearly, that's false because it happens to the flat earthers.
Well, with flat Earth, we have other ideas that can speak against what he's saying.
Well, no, that's
And so-
irrelevant. So I'm not counting the things against him. I don't care about the things against him. I'm only counting the positive claims here. I don't care. There could be infinitely many negative claims against your hypothesis. You could say, I believe in a round square, something logically impossible, and the round square is going to cause X, and if X happens, that's evidence of X. I don't care how impossible it is. I don't care what the evidence against it is. Makes no difference to me at all. If it works, it works. So
do you accept the historical that Christianity is a historic religion?
all of them are. I don't know what that means.
Well, that something occurred in the past to generate the origin of the Christian faith. Would you agree?
All religions are.
Okay, so your historical, so it's grounded in history, and for Christianity, it's 2,000 years of history, and you're saying that.
Well, I'd say more than that, but yeah.
Well, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'm just clarifying. So you're saying that the history of Christianity is insufficient or not adequate, or it doesn't count as evidence.
It doesn't count as evidence, correct.
You're saying the history of Christianity does not count as evidence for the case for the Christian faith.
Yeah, because they never produced any novel testable predictions. Well, they attested to it. If they did, that would count as evidence. So if Jesus actually rose from the dead, that would be good evidence. Like if Jesus predicted in 3 days I would rise again, and if that actually happened, I'd be like, yep, that is evidence. I wouldn't count it as sufficient.
Well, we have a record of that actually happening.
Oh, we have accounts of that happening. We have no actual evidence it did happen.
So the accounts, why don't the accounts count as evidence in the cumulative case?
Same reason the accounts of Toru don't count when we're Pygmy Island. So, like, for example, if we're in the middle of a Pygmy Island and somebody who's like 2 feet to or less says, oh, I know Toru, I've met him. He's given me visions that he created the Pac-Man. Like, no, that's not evidence. So you require the background empirical data that what you're saying is true, because your testimony can't differentiate imagination from reality.
So I can't. So when we talk about the history of Christianity, your statement about that not counting as evidence, you're saying that I can't make a testable novel prediction about Christianity because none of the history of it counts as evidence. Is that right?
No, if you could, that'd be great evidence. Go for it.
Okay, so the history of Christianity began with the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. Do you agree?
No, but I mean, that would be a prediction.
Okay, so what if it, okay, so if you don't agree, briefly, what do you think happened historically?
Exactly the same as every other human religion. People had ideas. They had emotional connection to the ideas, and they got attached to them.
Okay, so you believe that the origin of the Christian faith is an emotional idea that people got connected to, and therefore it began like every other religion.
Yeah.
Do you have a novel testable prediction that shows that to be true?
Yes. Well, it's already been novelly testable, predicted by people in psychology and sociology for hundreds of years. They
What is
did.
the novel? What is the novel testable prediction that Christianity began on people's feelings? How do you
Uh,
test? How do you
that
test that?
has already been tested. So it's the novel testable predictions in psychology and sociology of how ideas form has already been confirmed through many tests in sociology and psychology. Like
Well, that may be about ideas, but specifically, we're talking about the historical origins of the Christian faith.
that makes no
Uh,
difference. It's like if I said I saw a dog, I don't need evidence of that dog. I can just give evidence of dogs in general. So if I can give evidence of novel testable predictions of dogs existing, then it's reasonable to infer the dog I'm particularly talking about exists is fine. So that's fine.
but
It has an
what's
implicit
the
impermanence.
prediction that religion began with a feeling, or that Christianity began with a feeling?
Uh,
What's the specific prediction that you
I'd
know
have
of
to
that?
research. This is just general basic 101 information in psychology,
Uh-huh.
sociology of how ideas work. So I'd have to like actually just Google what is the basis of ideas and cultures or whatever. It's the same thing. So there's not, this isn't really like a controversial point. It's just basic psychology and sociology. This happens all the time. And we have novel
Okay,
test predictions, tons of them about doing exactly this. That's like the entire field of not psychology and sociology.
but when it comes down to actual historical investigation of the past, historians, not psychologists and psychiatrists, but historians who study this, um, there's not. It would be very difficult to do a novel testable prediction that could be falsified in the 21st century about the psychology of people that lived 2000 years ago. How do you accomplish that?
In the same psychology that people have today. You say people
Oh,
have
so
this
you
kinds of belief
okay.
system. So same thing counts for Christianity. If you can predict something today, future testable prediction, it would also apply to 2000 years ago. Like if you could predict miracles today, then it would be reasonable to infer the same kinds of miracles could have happened 2000 years ago.
Okay, so you think that the psychologists of the 21st century know more about the psychological makeup of the people of the first century who believe to have experienced the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Is that correct?
Definitely.
Okay,
But
all right.
that's not relevant to my argument, but definitely.
Okay. Well, it just seems to me that if you have, so here's the problem that I see, that when it comes to allowing for the evidence of Christianity as the history of Christianity as discounting that as evidence, it would seem that psychological explanations for the history of Christianity, not historical ones but psychological ones, are also outside the purview of your testable, reliable prediction criteria. I
No,
don't
no,
see
I just demonstrated it does fit in that
but
criteria. So
how do you test the psychological makeup of people of the first century? How
you
would you do
test the
that?
psychological makeup of people today, and then you
Well,
apply that
that's
inductively to
different
people of the
though.
past. No, no, it
That's a
has nothing. This
cultural.
has nothing to do with cultural. It has to do with biology and neurology of the human makeup, which has essentially been the same for hundreds of thousands of years. So this is all just human beings. We're talking about how the human brain works. The human brain works today the same way it did 2,000 years ago, same way it did 20,000 years ago. So there's
All
not
right.
really sufficient difference there. So if you can show the human brain today is flawed enough to get attached to certain silly ideas because it makes you feel good, like the world is flat, then it's reasonable to infer in the past the brain was silly enough to get attached to silly emotional ideas that made them feel good, like religious beliefs.
But
So
what if we put atheism in the hot seat and said that it's just something that people made up to make themselves feel good because of the psychology of people in the 21st century that don't want to believe Jesus existed? How do you
uh,
test that?
that would be fine, except atheism doesn't make any claims. So atheism is just the position there is no evidence of God for the most part. So the origin of the belief doesn't make a difference in its negative claim.
Okay, so let me just wrap up because I don't think we'll make too much progress on this. But your position is that the history of Christianity and its origin can be explained by 21st century psychology and psychiatry without any other reference to historical documentation to the contrary. Is that correct?
I would say that all phenomenon in the past can be compared to phenomenon today. And if we can find it today, that there is some common feature of psychology, and that common feature of psychology can be used to explain certain accounts of the past, then yes, those would be the same thing by definition. Just like
All right.
people who
And
fall on gong, like people who see UFOs, people who see uh, mass hysteria. We discover those things in the present in modern day psychology, and then we look into the past and see, oh look, those phenomenon that are described in history look exactly like this thing we've discovered in the present. Those are the same thing. That's
okay,
reasonable
so
science.
your position at present is that Christianity began because it made people have an emotionally positive experience. Is that correct?
Yes, same as
Okay. So
every belief.
that's your account of how Christianity developed a handful of emotionally positive experiences that people had of Jesus rising from the dead.
Well, I'd say just emotionally positive experiences of lots of different people for lots of different reasons. So if people thought Jesus rose from the dead, that could be a positive experience. If people were told about it, that could be a positive experience. If people were told they could have life after death, that could be a positive experience. All beliefs in humanity are emotionally based off of usually positive experiences. That's just how psychology has demonstrated that.
Okay, so
I mean,
what
even
do you
if
think?
Jesus actually rose from the dead, Christianity would still have been based off of the positive experiences people had from
Oh,
that
you
experience.
still have a positive experience. I mean, if it was true, obviously there is positive experience to be
Right.
had from it, certainly. Do you think, though, so you don't actually think that these people, the multitude of people in and around Jerusalem in the first century, actually saw, or actually, you say the apostles and what we have in 1 Corinthians 15, you don't think anybody really saw Jesus alive after he had been in the grave?
Nope,
Correct.
most likely a delusion, hallucination, all the things we have made testable novel predictions that have been confirmed that do exist that are reasonable to infer
Okay,
occurred in the past.
true people have psychological delusions and things, but it has yet to be facilitated in the research that there can be a large mass group hysteria or hallucination about a specific a specific thing, that everybody's hallucinating the same thing. That
Nope,
seems
we
to be
have that in the data, but even if we didn't, that would still be more reasonable than miracle because we know one delusion can happen. So even if a mass delusion was less likely, it's still infinitely more likely than something we have no evidence of, like a miracle. So there's two
okay.
parts to that. One is that we do actually have that. It's called mass hysteria and folia do, folia tree. So we do have examples of that. Secondly, even if we didn't, the fact that we have a delusion as a demonstrable real thing that's made novel testable predictions means it is infinitely more likely and has infinitely more evidence than a miracle, which still has zero.
Okay, so you would prefer, despite the lack of actual scientific psychological data on mass
Well, no,
delusion.
I just gave you a list of that actually exists. We have that.
Yeah, well, no, I'm not saying that delusions don't happen. I'm
No, I'm
saying
saying
on the
mass hysteria
scale
on a
that,
mass thing, the mass scales, folia do, folia tree, mass hysteria, those we literally have examples of exactly that.
okay, so you're saying that is really the best explanation for how Christianity began, was hallucinations.
Well, no, I'm not saying best. I'm saying that explanation is better than miracle.
Okay, so you're a priori excluding miracles,
Nope,
kind of
I
like
am
he.
not a priori excluding anything. I'm saying we have past evidence of hysteria. We have past evidence of delusion. So those things we know exist like dogs. And so if we want to say what caused the footprint in the snow, dog is always going to be better than unicorn because we have past evidence of dogs. We have no past evidence of unicorns. So dog is always necessarily a better explanation until you can provide evidence of unicorns.
So a miracle, by definition, though, is a rare occurrence.
I don't care. Like, it doesn't make a difference to me how rare it is. If you can make future testable predictions with it, that's evidence. Doesn't matter how rare it is.
And we have, okay, so let's talk about. I'll just be personal here for my own example. I'm not saying that this is proof. We're not. We agree that we're not after proof in the mathematical Euclidean sense. But here are some examples of my own experience, and I'm not saying that they make Christianity certain. But I was a changed individual after coming to Christ in 1993. So here are my tests very briefly. I was baptized in 93. I was in the military for 4 years with a tour in the Middle East working with Muslims. I have a bachelor's degree at a secular university. I have a master's degree from a Christian university. One of the things that I really enjoyed that really helped me engage my Christian faith was the Mars Hill Audio Journal. It gave me a perspective of how Christianity and contemporary culture go together. It's a wonderful resource that probably saved me from becoming an atheist. I've had multiple appearances on atheist shows: Dogma Debate, Right to Reason, Cordial Curiosity, Non Sequitur when it was still around, and Atheist Edge, of course. And I've had enjoyable discussions with you, Tom, examining what I believe with people that don't believe like I do. I am currently a administrative facilitator for our Atheist and Christian Book Club. We used to meet regularly in Arlington in person before the COVID. But we make dinner and sit down and have a chat about atheist and Christian discussions about a book once a month. It's a great group, and I miss it. And I'm now a staff apologist at Watchman.org, examining other non-Christian ideas and worldviews. I've also been through a great deal of suffering, as we all have. I struggle with depression, as I've shared with you. I've gone through a lot of loss, my father's suicide, my fiance breaking an engagement. I've lost jobs and friends. Personal experience of miraculous healing in my own life when I was in my 20s, reading, studying, and engaging with scripture, the testimonies of other Christians, the historical reliability of the origin of the Christian faith, and ultimately for me, what I enjoy the most, the beauty and intelligibility of the cosmos, putting together a book with other professional Christian scholars and scientists. And that's this book. And I know you've read about it, The Story of the Cosmos. And I've done podcast interviews with atheists, with authors, with scholars on 2 podcasts that I produce. And so 27 years of living out what I believe are what I would consider to be, you could test and predict what my life was like before I was a Christian. And now you can make testable predictions about what my life would be like, as you would expect. Go ahead.
Which testable predictions? Where are the testable predictions? Because testable predictions need to predict something we don't know yet. So what is the novel testable prediction in any of that?
Well, what would you expect of someone who claims to be following the teachings of Jesus in the Bible? What would you expect from somebody? What would you expect their life to be? What would you expect them to do?
I'd expect them to be human, just like every other human, and not much different than any other human.
Not much different?
But yeah, I'd say that they're going to live a life that's going to be human, and they're going to have human experiences and have human things in their life, just like every other human. So, like, your story is essentially the same as millions of other people's stories and millions of other countries of millions of other religions. It's just a human story. Like, there's nothing special about that story that you listed. It's the same as lots of other people's stories.
So, but I'm not saying it proves Christianity. I'm saying that,
again, so anytime you bring that up, it doesn't matter, because I'm not trying to say it's not. I'm saying it's not even evidence. Like, nothing in that what you listed, other than the miraculous healings. Miraculous healings would actually be great evidence if you could demonstrate them. But other than that, everything you listed was just common human experience. I saw the sun rise tomorrow, therefore God, is essentially your argument.
Well, no. I'm saying that by you saying that nothing that I have said counts as evidence is a presupposition about.
No, I said no presupposition. So you're not allowed to say it's a presupposition, because I haven't given it.
You're assessing what I'm sharing, and you're saying it's not evidence.
Where did I presuppose anything? What is my presupposition?
The presupposition that you're saying that it's not evidence. You're just telling me that's not evidence.
Like, presupposition means something that you assume is true before you make an argument. I didn't presuppose
and you've
anything.
Assumed what I've shared is not evidence.
No, I didn't assume any of that. All of that, none of that makes novel testable predictions, which is a criterion. It's not a assumption, it's a post assumption. So I'm looking at the evidence. Does this fit the criterion of evidence? No, it does not. Therefore, it is not evidence. That's not a presupposition at all, because it doesn't.
Yeah, you have to build the criterion. Like, if I say, like, again, the criterion of what TJump is like, I would have to know that to say there's no evidence.
I need to know what. So again, there are 0 presuppositions in my worldview at all. So my criterion of evidence is our imagination does not affect the world. So if you make an idea of what's in the world, and it can make a future testable prediction about the world and get it right, that's good evidence your idea corresponds to something in the world and not just in your head. That's not a presupposition. That's something we demonstrated. That's why science requires it.
I'll offer something that happened to me. I'll offer briefly my what happened to me in my 20s. I had a completely ruptured appendix in my body for almost a month. Totally ruptured. Now, most people, when they have a month, I was misdiagnosed as having stomach flu when I first went to the doctor, and I lived with it I had it for about a week.
Wait, so it was like it was a partial rupture.
No, it was the whole thing, Tom.
If the whole thing, you would die in an hour. So that
I know, that's what I'm saying. And I have the surgeon's testimony, who came in after my operation and said, and he was from Texas, and I was scared to death when he told me. He said, "Son, I don't know why you're still alive," because he removed not only a gigantic, probably softball size worth of pus and mass from my abdomen area, and could not explain to me why I was still alive. He says, "This stuff normally kills people within days. And you had it," based on the amount of stuff that he removed from my abdomen. He said, there's absolutely no medical reason for why you're still here. And I have, to this day, no explanation myself, other than it was a miracle, because I had poison all over.
Was that like a future testable prediction? Did you like pray to God and then he healed you? Or was it just, you can't explain it and that was it? event you can't
Well,
explain.
I have a veteran surgeon who has done appendicitis operations in the medical research that says, just as you say, that if you have a completely ruptured appendix within 3 or 4 days, you're dead. And I was walking around with stuff in my gut for a month.
Okay, so just to clarify, you had a medical experience you can't explain is one possibility, or like for example, you had a disease and you prayed to God and then the disease was healed. That would be a future testable prediction. That would be confirmed. That would be evidence. So if like, I have a disease, I pray to God, the disease gets healed. I have a disease, I pray to God, it gets healed.
Well,
blah,
I
blah.
know people had been praying.
Right. So I'm just clarifying your story here. So that would be evidence. If you just said, I had a medical experience, which doctors couldn't explain, that's not evidence of anything. That's just a phenomenon you can't explain.
Well, see, and I think that's where the material presuppositions that you have.
There's no presupposition. I didn't say anything about presupposition, so you can't bring that in.
Yeah, you're saying, well, you can't explain it, therefore we can't count it as evidence, or it's not a miracle.
Well, that's just by definition an argument from ignorance. Here is something we can't explain, therefore it's evidence of nothing. It's the phenomenon. Therefore, it to be evidence, you need to make a future testable prediction. So it's just the definition of an argument from ignorance. There's no presupposition there. It's just
philosophy. I don't think it's an argument from ignorance, because you look at the cumulative case about what happened here. There is nothing in the science that can explain what happened to me.
If nothing in the science is by definition an argument from ignorance, anytime you say that. So it's necessarily an argument from ignorance.
Not at all. It's an argument to the best. It's an argument to the best explanation. If God exists, that miracles are entirely possible.
Again, so if that's like, if we see a footprint in the snow, it could be a dog, and we have lots of evidence of dogs. So that's a possible explanation that is reasonable to make a conclusion of, or it could be a unicorn. Now, saying that, well, no dog could explain that footprint. Well, since we know dogs exist, they're always going to be better than unicorn. You can't ever conclude unicorn. The same thing applies to a miracle. So for example, you have a medical experience you can't explain, then saying it's an unknown natural thing is always going to be better because we have empirical evidence of those.
No, that's a presupposition.
That's not a presupposition. That's just induction. That's
no. I think, well, that is.
You keep saying presupposition. There are literally no presuppositions in my worldview, so you cannot say presupposition.
Well, there are, Tom, because you're excluding what could possibly be miraculous as an argument for
ignorance. No, I never did that. I never presupposed anything. This is just induction, basic philosophy, basic evidence, basic scientific method.
Not certain. I mean, induction doesn't give you the certainty that what I experience is not a miracle, and it doesn't give you the certainty that it's an argument from ignorance, though. It doesn't tell you that.
It does give you certainty it's an argument from ignorance, because you literally just said
no, because you're using ideas and you're making inferences, and inferences don't give you certitude. You're making an inference.
You don't need certitude for anything. So fallibilism, you don't need.
No, I know you don't. But your presuppositional idea of materialism, and that what
there is no presupposition again. So you keep straw manning my position, saying nothing that's in any way relevant to my position. So you're addressing something that has nothing to do with anything I said.
No. You're telling me that what I experience is not a miracle, but it's an argument from ignorance.
No, I'm not saying it's not a miracle. I'm saying that's not evidence of a miracle.
Well, by you saying that it's not evidence of a miracle says to me that you know what evidence of a miracle would be.
Yes, novel testable predictions.
Well, I don't see the criteria.
Anything
I don't. You'll have to see what I don't. What I'm not following is how you know that novel testable predictions are actually what would count as evidence for a miracle. You would have to test your idea of novel testable predictions to be an accurate representation of what would demonstrate the miraculous.
Yes,
and
yes.
you can't test your own ideas there.
Yes, you can. I did that. I explained that earlier. So we have ideas. Ideas don't affect reality. I can't lift up the TV with my imagination. So if I want to test my ideas, I can say, if my idea is correct, I can do an experiment to try and verify it with sense experience. And if it is correct, that's a good evidence that my idea corresponds to reality, not just my imagination. So that does exactly what you just said. So my ideas...
I think your idea of novel testable predictions is something conceptually that falls into the definition of what you consider to be imaginary, because there's no physical test, Tom, that you could do to prove that what you're saying about miracles is accurate.
Yeah, that's fine. So I have an idea in my head that I can novel testable prediction criteria or whatever. So, but I can demonstrate that my ideas don't affect reality. I cannot do things in reality with my ideas. I can't lift the TV. I can't push things over. I can't read the stars. I can't know things about what's happening on the other side of the planet. My ideas do not affect reality. We can demonstrate this. This isn't a presupposition. This isn't conceptual. It is something we literally experience. It is a direct experience. So we know there is a difference between our imagination and reality. And so and there's lots of things we can imagine. Like we can imagine what knocked over that cup. It could be a fairy, could be a leprechaun, a unicorn, genie, whatever. You can imagine infinitely many things that could knock over that cup. But only a select few of them will be able to predict it, or will be able to explain what knocked over the cup and then predict something new about the world we don't know yet and get it right.
But the novelty idea is not, I don't see how that is, that you can test that novelty is an essential element for determining if something is miraculous or not.
But
novelty seems to be...
So I'll just clarify, this is evidence of anything that isn't imaginary, which includes miracles or science or reality.
But it just seems like you're just adding a priori that novelty must be part of the standard. And I don't see how that's not subjective.
It's science, so it's definitely objective by definition. But
science doesn't require that something be novel in order for it to be a legitimate aspect of evidence of something. It doesn't have to be novel.
Yeah, it does. That's kind of the point.
No, I mean, what scientific test shows that novelty is a prerequisite, an epistemic prerequisite for making new discoveries?
It is the foundation of what can differentiate imagination from reality. That is the test. So it's like saying, if you want to differentiate between these 10 ideas that all explain the phenomenon, how do you do it? Here's how you do it. And this one works. And this one works and produces new stuff that works better.
So what about the assumption that the idea of evidence for God must be tested through scientific empirical investigation, as you're suggesting?
No, I'd say just novel testable predictions. You can make any predictions you want. I don't care. It doesn't make a difference.
Okay, so we get back to this idea that it seems to be your epistemic ground that novel testable predictions is the standard for everything.
Yes, the only standard I know of that can differentiate imagination.
How do you test for that to be accurate?
I just explained that like 10 times. So this is just the foundation.
No. I hear your explanation, but I don't. I mean, how does that translate into empirical? It seems like you're conflating two things, like a knocking over of a coffee cup. You're taking an idea, and you're saying, "Well, my idea can't knock over the coffee cup," and I understand that, and I completely understand that. But when you're talking about saying that novel testable predictions are the standard by which we judge miracles, that seems to stay in the realm of the abstract conceptual idea. And that can't, if you will, knock over 2,000 years of Christian history.
So maybe I'm not explaining this well. So ideas don't affect reality. They're all in our head. They're fake. They're not real. They don't do anything.
I disagree. Ideas do affect reality. Of course they do.
No. So I can't lift up the TV with my ideas. I can't, most ideas are wrong.
But a lot of what we're talking about, Tom, is conceptual and abstract, and they do impact how people think about reality.
That's fine, but it doesn't do anything to reality. That's the point, is that the ideas are imaginary. They're things in our head that do not affect reality. They can affect us, which we can affect reality, but they don't affect reality. Like I can't lift stuff up with my mind. I can't tell you what the lottery numbers are going to be with my imagination. I'm not going to be able to imagine what the universe is like, or just imagine the constants of the universe. So I'm not referencing something in reality. A priori, there is nothing that can tell you anything about the world. Ideas do not correspond to reality just because they're ideas. So there's some difference between our imagination and reality. These are not the same thing. Our imagination is not reality. Reality is not our imagination.
Okay, well, let me ask you, what is your definition of reality?
The stuff that exists.
So do ideas exist in reality?
Yes, in our heads. Okay, they're not the same as reality.
Is reality just physical?
Yes, that's based on the best evidence, but again, that's not relevant to my argument at all. So it's not.
No. Well, it helps because you keep using it as a basis for measuring things. You want to measure things against reality, or you want to make a dividing line between imaginary and reality. And it seems to me that, if I'm understanding you correctly, that your idea of imaginary is non-physical. Your idea of
nope. So that's again irrelevant to my argument.
Physical.
Totally irrelevant to my argument. Doesn't matter if you're an idealist, a physicalist, a dualist. All of this the same applies to every single one of the worldviews. There is some difference between imagination and reality, whether that reality is physical or mental or a combination of both. Makes no difference. Things in our head do not correspond to the things in the world. They are different things.
What about mathematics? What about mathematics?
Again, so you can.
Does that course? I mean, that's an idea in our head that corresponds to the physical world.
No, it does not. That's again, it's.
Oh yes, it does. We just went through that.
F equals ma times 7. Does F equals ma times 7 correspond to the world?
It does. I mean, there's some. I mean, mathematics.
No, okay. So math is the language just like any other. 1 + 1 = 2
is in our head. And it affects how we investigate. It resonates with the physical world.
No, again, so some of our ideas, a very small percent of them, can correspond to reality. Do our ideas correspond to reality? No, they are false. 99.999% of them are all false. They're all wrong. So the fact that some small percent of our ideas can correspond to reality, you need a way to differentiate the 99% of crap ones with the 0.001% of good ones. And the way we do that is novel testable predictions. Some ideas can potentially correspond to reality. Most ideas do not. The vast majority of them do not. So that's the way you need to differentiate between the imaginary stuff that does not correspond to reality and the imaginary stuff that does correspond to reality.
But you still have this abstract conceptual idea of reality in your head, which you think all other things must cohere.
Right. So again, listen to it again. You need a way to differentiate the parts of our imagination that do correspond and the parts of our imagination that don't. So I have an idea of reality that maybe does and maybe doesn't, and I need some way to tell the difference between those two things.
And you're saying, in your definition, and what I've heard you say over the last few minutes, you're saying that your concept of reality does not permit the historical 2,000 years of Christian history as evidence for the reality of the Christian faith.
No, I'm saying you don't have a way to do that. That's the problem. My worldview doesn't matter here. My worldview is irrelevant here.
You have an idea of what...
No. So my worldview is irrelevant here. All that matters is can your worldview differentiate between imagination and reality? That's what I keep asking. Can you do this? Do you have a method to do this?
Yeah, you've created this standard based on this idea of your reality that everything in reality...
You agreed to this standard last video. So we agree on the standard. You need to be able to differentiate imagination from reality. That's kind of what evidence is.
That's right. When we didn't get into to your concept of reality, which is coming to bear here. I think
my concept of reality is again irrelevant. So as long as you agree that your ideas don't correspond to reality, then we agree.
I think your idea of reality is very important because it's acting right now as a filter for what does and does not count as evidence for something.
Nope. Again, my definition of reality is irrelevant. As I said multiple times, you're strawmanning me again. That has nothing to do with my position. Do you agree that I can have an imagination of a unicorn and unicorns don't exist?
Absolutely.
Okay, so there is a difference between imagination and reality. Some things in our imagination are false. They do not exist in reality.
I agree.
And there's lots of them. Most of the things we imagine do not exist in reality.
But when it comes down to brass tacks about what exists in reality, when we talk about God, you're saying that there is no evidence.
No. Just keep going with me here. So the ideas in our head, there's lots of them. We have ideas of millions of different gods.
Oh, I'm clear.
Most of our ideas don't exist in reality, correct?
Well, let me. I don't want to have you repeat again because I do understand. I think I do understand.
So if most of our ideas do not exist in reality, you need a way to differentiate the things in our head which do not exist in reality to the things in reality that do exist in reality, right?
Right. And you have an idea.
My idea here is irrelevant. So I'm saying, do you have a way to differentiate between those two? I don't care about my worldview.
Yeah, I do. I've given you all these ways in which I've done this.
Which one? Give me one specifically.
These are the ways in which I've done these.
This has
been over the course of 27 years. I've investigated Christianity down to its core. I've read the Bible. I've talked to atheists.
I need a specific point here. Give me one specific thing that can differentiate imagination from reality.
Truth.
That's just the same thing as the definition. So that's not a way.
Well, no, it absolutely boils down to what is truth, as Jesus asked.
Obviously, that's the definition, but I need to know what method you can use to differentiate imagination from reality. I know truth is the definition between imagination and reality, but I need to know how you get to that truth.
Well, that's the point. The epistemic ground for truth is not something that, as I see from what you're explaining, can be defined by novel testable predictions. You're just assuming that.
I didn't. So again, I'm asking you, how do you differentiate between imagination and reality?
And I'm saying that your idea of how to differentiate.
I didn't say anything about my idea. I said, how do you differentiate between imagination and reality?
And truth. And my idea of truth is grounded in the person and the work of Jesus.
Okay. So how do you differentiate between imagination and reality?
Well, Jesus is real. I begin there. And he is, as he attests to himself as being the way, the truth, and the life.
So my question is how do you differentiate between imagination and reality? And saying Jesus is real doesn't get you a way to tell the difference between those two things.
Why not?
Say,
how come?
The spaghetti monster is real.
Okay, so you think the spaghetti monster is in the same category as Jesus?
I'm just saying, here's your method. So I said, how do you differentiate between imagination and reality? And you gave a noun and said noun is real. So I'm just gonna give a different noun and say noun is real. And so does that show that the noun is real? No.
And so you say spaghetti monster. Do you feel that that is categorically similar to Jesus
It's
of Nazareth?
irrelevant again. So the argument here is that you presented a methodology to differentiate imagination from reality, and all I need to do to disprove that method is to show that that method cannot differentiate imagination from reality. So unicorns are real, square circles are real, magic pixies are real. Like I can just assert things are real, but that doesn't give me a way to differentiate imagination from reality.
Okay, so in my own investigation of Jesus and the Christian faith, that doesn't count, right?
Which part of that can differentiate imagination from reality?
Well, I begin with truth, and I begin with how does Christianity interact with the rest of the world?
That doesn't tell me anything. Like, how do you differentiate imagination from reality?
By the truth of who Jesus is. He determines he's the one that created reality. And so I go by the definition of how he explains what reality is through his word.
I have no idea. Like none of that is a method I can use to differentiate imagination from reality. You gotta like give me some kind of thing that we can use to tell the difference between imagination and reality. Just starting with Jesus is just begging the question. It's just circular reasoning. It applies to anything. Like I think
it's the same kind of epistemic category that you begin with this idea of novel testable predictions. That just seems to be your bedrock assumption.
Well, there's no assumption there, but again, that's so we can contrast the two worldviews. We have your worldview. You just start with Jesus. That's called begging the question. You can just start with whatever you want and assert it is true. And
well, I don't start with whatever I want. We all have to start somewhere. I mean, even if people who are skeptics will have something to say about Jesus, their assumptions about Jesus begin somewhere. Epistemically, we all have to have a starting point of somewhere. And I think that epistemically, that none of us can finally, scientifically test our epistemic starting point.
So that's a tu quo fallacy. Oh, well, you're doing it too. Well, one, I'm not doing it. I don't have presuppositions.
I'm saying that our assumptions about reality, Tom, finally have to be taken on a measure of faith that cannot be tested.
So I have no assumptions. I have no assumptions about reality. I have no presuppositions at all. I've gotten rid of those from my worldview completely. So those aren't a part of my worldview. So I start with I think, therefore I am. That's not an assumption. It's not a presupposition. It's literally a direct experience. That's it. That is, and then I just use math and logic as languages to describe that experience, and I can build a model of the world based off of those things. I make no assumptions, no presuppositions.
Well, okay, so let's just begin.
Before I lose my train of thought. So, we know that there's some difference between imagination and reality. We agree on that, and we need someone to differentiate. You just say, here is my asserted basis of starting point. Circular reasoning, anyone can do that. My starting point does not do that. It does not have that problem, because my starting point is I think, therefore I am. I can differentiate, and I create a language, math and logic, to describe the difference, and then we can tell the difference between imagination and reality by making novel test predictions, which we can demonstrate, because there's lots of ideas I can have, and the ones that do make predictions do exist in reality. We can confirm that. We can say, oh, this idea that I thought was real, like the Higgs boson, made a prediction about reality, and then we can discover that prediction is true because we can discover the Higgs. We can say, oh, that idea does exist in reality. So mine doesn't have that problem. I'm not begging the question and just starting with what I want to be true. I'm testing it and demonstrating it to be true.
Yeah, I don't see that you can or have adequately justified your novel testable prediction epistemology. I mean, I understand you've explained it, but that's not it's not clear that is the place to begin with how you know the reality. It just seems like you have a starting point as well, and I don't fault you for the starting point. I think we all have a starting point that we can't finally justify through the methods and tools of science. It's beyond that, Tom, and I think we all have to kind of pick a starting point and then work it out in accordance with, as you say, with the best kind of evidence that reality gives us. So let me clarify, because I see. Before I finish, let me just clarify, because I think it's an important distinction. So faith, for me, faith in Christ, is an active trust. It's not a source of my knowledge. Faith is not the source of my knowledge, but a response to knowledge. So the mathematics of the Higgs equation, for example, is the source of knowledge. And then building the Large Hadron Collider to test the mathematics is the faith, a response to the mathematics. So faith isn't the source of my knowledge. Christ is the source of my knowledge, and my faith is an active trust in what he has said, and I act in accordance with that, and I have over the last 27 years. So if we take the person of Jesus of Nazareth, everybody in the comment section, everybody has an opinion about who Jesus is. That knowledge comes from...
Not everyone does, because some people don't know about him. We didn't know about him for many years. Many people never knew about him. So I'm saying that...
Okay, so I'll just limit it to the comment section, everybody in here, and most people in the Western civilization know who Jesus is or know something about him. But that knowledge of who Christ is begins with a certain set of assumptions that nobody can finally prove. So people make fun of me for saying, I start with Jesus. But then I hear all these comments that say, well, Jesus is this and Jesus is that and Jesus is this, and I'm crazy for starting there. But the objections to who Jesus is begin with a certain set of assumptions as well. And so what I'm saying is that when we look at the physical world, we act in accordance with those assumptions, and a lot of those assumptions, epistemologically, metaphysically, philosophy, we cannot finally test or demonstrate in any kind of empirical way. That's logical positivism, and that's a philosophy that died out last century. So, I mean, we can't prove, and I don't think, I can't finally prove that Jesus is who he says he is. I have to live in accordance with faith by that. But I also think at the same time, Tom, and it's not necessarily a criticism, but I don't see how that you can demonstrate through novel testable predictions that novel testable predictions are the only way in which we can know if God exists.
Again, so you've mischaracterized so much there. It's so hard to go through this. So you have a circular reasoning starting point. You start with whatever you want to start with, and anybody can do that. So that methodology we know for a fact fails. And then you apply a tu quo q fallacy. Well, you're doing it too. You have a presupposition. Well, no, my worldview doesn't have a presupposition at all. There's none. Mine starts with...
I think you do, but we'll disagree there.
You can't think I do. You're not allowed to get an opinion on my position there. So I have, mine is I think, therefore I am. That is the starting point of my position. There is no presupposition. There is no assumption there. It's just I think, therefore I am. That's a fact. It's an observable fact. It's an experience.
You can't demonstrate your experience to anybody else but you, Tom.
I don't need to. That's not a part. Why do you even bring that up? That's not relevant. That's not a presupposition. That's not an assumption. That's not a part of my worldview.
You want to take the I
apologize.
and make that a basis for reality as you're judging it. You want to say that, but to me, you cannot convey your own internal experience to anybody else but you.
That was not a part of my premises. None of that was in my premises. My premises is I think, therefore I am. I didn't say I can then therefore prove I exist to other people. That was never a part of any part of my explanation of my worldview. That was not there.
But it's important for your worldview, because if you can't demonstrate your own existence to people, then your idea of reality also is beyond being able to be demonstrated clearly.
Nope, that's irrelevant too, because none of that was a premise in my worldview. So my worldview is I think, therefore I am. There's some difference between my imagination and my experience, and I use logic and math to describe those things. That is the basis of my reality. Nowhere premise.
How do you know logic and math are actually a part of the reality you're trying to describe? You're assuming
they're made up languages I use to describe this. They don't exist anywhere. They're just languages. They're like English.
Your reality is there. I think, therefore I am, and you're using made up languages to describe what you think reality is.
No, to describe the fact that I exist.
Okay, so you've made up a language to describe the fact that you exist, but you can't prove your existence to anybody else other than yourself.
I don't need to. That wasn't a part of anywhere in my argument, so that's not relevant. So
well, it makes it because you say that I'm being arbitrary and starting with Christ, and you're just starting with yourself.
Right. So I can't believe I exist and not exist at the same time. That'll be impressive if I could. So that's not an arbitrary starting point. That's literally a necessary truth of reality that I exist if I'm experiencing I exist. So that is a good starting point. That isn't circular. That's a necessary truth of reality.
Why can't Jesus say the same thing about himself?
He could. I mean, but you can't say it about him, just like I can't say it about you.
Okay, hold on a second. Why can't I say it about him?
For the same reason you just said, that I can't prove my existence to other people.
I'm going by your standards, not mine here. I'm saying, why am I not allowed to say that Jesus can say I am as well?
He is. Everyone who exists is allowed to use their own existence as a starting point.
Okay. So your existence as your starting point is denying my ability to say that Jesus is my starting point, correct?
Well, no. That was what you agreed to. So as you said earlier, there is no way for me to prove that I exist to everyone else. Right.
Yeah, that's your world.
But the same would apply to everyone. So you can't say, I'm going to start with something else as my grounding, because for the exact same reason. Like I could just pick...
You just told me that if you start with yourself and you're using made-up language to describe yourself to yourself, I don't see how any other prescription about epistemology could apply to anybody else, Tom.
That's
how?
A starting point. I don't. There's no relevance to what you just said to my position there. I don't even
Yeah,
know.
you've explained to me that you begin with yourself. I
Right.
am, therefore I think, therefore I am.
Right.
And then you say that you use made up language to describe your own experience to yourself.
Sure.
But then if you've made up this language and you can't demonstrate your own existence and you're beginning with yourself, you are then trying to externally apply that epistemological axiom to everybody else, which is inconsistent with the
Nope.
way in which you've described your own
That
existence.
haven't gotten anywhere. That wasn't in any of my premises. So no. So the
Okay.
question is here is what is a reasonable starting point for knowledge? One is here is a necessary truth that I exist. That's a reasonable starting point for knowledge. It's not circular. It's not begging the question because you can't use the same method to get a non-imaginary conclusion. Like I can't say I think therefore I am and be wrong. So that can't be false about reality. So I can't use this same method to get an imaginary non-real conclusion. This method is always going to get a real conclusion 100% of the time. But
Saying that your falsifiable, testable predictions is going to get the same conclusion, you mean?
no, I'm saying I exist. I exist as the
Okay,
starting
your
point. So
existence, but your existence and your experience are only demonstrable to yourself.
I again never said any of that. So the question is what is the starting point for knowledge? What is a good ground of
Yes,
knowledge? I ground
that's a good.
knowledge in I think, therefore I am. Full stop. No other sentences uttered. No other premises. No other science. No future tested predictions. Haven't gotten to any of that. This is
Yeah,
just the grounding
I
point for
understand.
knowledge. I start
Right.
with I think, therefore I am. That is not circular. It is a necessary truth. You can't get it wrong with this. This can differentiate imagination from reality.
But when you go so far as to say that when this premise of origin of epistemology, when you start with that starting point, and then you
Say that again.
attempt to say that Christianity, for example, just going back to the example that's on the table, the history of Christianity does not count as evidence
Oh no, so
for.
that's way down the line here. So we're just starting with the starting point of what you said. You start with Jesus is the truth, and I start with I
Yeah,
think therefore I am. So
right.
your starting point is a begging the question. You can just start with anything you want in the same vein as what you did,
But I'm
and
not just starting with anything that I want. I'm starting with something that's been around a lot longer than I have. I'm not just
that's
making this up. I'm not
different,
claiming to
different,
use
different.
imaginary language to
Not
describe my
not
position as.
not
So
relevant to the point right
the
now.
problem I
So
have, Tom, is that you've confessed or you've admitted that you're using language that's imaginary and attempting to apply that to the rest of reality and
okay, so that
expecting
I don't I don't
that's a
think you understand the
forceful
difference here. So language that is imaginary doesn't change reality. Reality is still reality, even if the language you're using to describe it isn't. So it doesn't matter if
But
I
that
call
language that you're saying is just made up. I mean, I have
yeah,
no
the
other
language
standard to
doesn't
go
make a
by
difference. The
than
language doesn't affect reality. Reality exists independently of the language. The language is just a way to
what you
describe reality. So if I say I
you see
exist and I'm using made up language, I still exist regardless of whether or not the words are true.
but all of what you're saying to me is based on this premise that you've made up this language, Tom. I don't see it having any
I don't
objective.
understand what you're so the word tree is a word that's made up by humans. It doesn't exist. It doesn't need to exist. The trees exist independent of the word. The word doesn't matter. The trees still exist. So if I say I think therefore I am, I exist, my thinking exists. The words don't matter if they're arbitrary or not. You can change them to any words you want. They do not change the existence of me or my thinking. So the words don't matter. They're just a way to describe the things that do matter, which do exist independent of the words. So critiquing the made up language is irrelevant. It does nothing. It's just saying I'm using the representation of this word instead of saying it in Japanese doesn't make a difference. So that is irrelevant to my position at all. I think therefore I am is a truth about reality that can differentiate imagination from reality. The words and language don't matter. They're irrelevant to it. It's still true. It's still going to work every single time, no matter what language you use. So this method is not circular. It uses a necessary truth that's a grounded of knowledge that can differentiate imagination from reality. The methodology you presented, which is I start with Jesus, cannot differentiate imagination from reality
Yeah,
because we can just
that's where we disagree
right.
because
And
I
so
think
so this
I
is
think
this is the premise that I'm saying. How can yours do this? Mine can. Mine can clearly do this. How does yours do that?
well, for one thing, I think I mean, I don't mean this in any kind of dismissive way, Tom, but beginning with yourself, I mean, it seems obvious that we have ourselves to deal with. But if beginning with yourself, I mean, human beings aren't the arbiter of what constitutes reality. Number one, I mean, would you agree? There's things
Sure,
that beyond our finite knowledge that
definitely. Why is that relevant?
well, it's relevant because you're taking on this broad spectrum of defining reality. And it seems like that any of our conceptions of reality are going to be finite and limited.
Sure.
And you've expressed to me that the language that you use to demonstrate to yourself that you exist is imaginary, and that you say that the language is irrelevant.
So the language doesn't demonstrate anything. The existence is what demonstrates it. The language just describes the existence.
The existence itself has a correspondence to the language, because the language comes from us.
No, the language, the existence is true independent of any language. So if language never existed, the existence is still going to be there. The language makes no difference at all. You can just, the language does nothing to affect the argument. You can do anything you want with the language. It'll never change the argument. It'll never make it false. So,
sure, because language comes from ontology. Language comes from being. Language comes from our understanding of reality. Language corresponds to reality, as I demonstrated with mathematics.
It wouldn't matter if it didn't. So again, that's irrelevant to my argument. My argument is I exist.
No, I understand, but mathematics is a language that clearly has relevance and a connection to the larger world in which we exist. It's far beyond just being something that we made up. It absolutely has an integral reality to the physical cosmos.
Well, no, that's well, I can prove that false immediately, because F equals ma times 7. Like F equals ma corresponds to reality. F equals ma times 7 does not correspond to reality. So math is exactly like English, where you have sentences that do correspond to reality, like 1 + 1 = 2. Sentences that don't correspond to reality, like F equals ma times 7. And sentences that are self-contradictory, like 1 + 1 = 8. So just like in English, you can have...
We agree that there is mathematical correspondence to reality.
No. Math is exactly the same as English and logic and all of the languages made up by humans. So English, you have sentences that correspond to reality, like I am a human. You have sentences that don't correspond to reality, like I am a space leprechaun. You have sentences that are self-contradictory, like I am a married bachelor. Math is the exact same. It is just a representation of symbols to describe reality, exactly like English, no different.
Yeah. So here's where I think the difficulty is with epistemology that we're talking about. Is this idea, now there's a subtle difference between induction and abduction, but abduction, basically, it doesn't guarantee that the conclusion is accurate. But when it comes to history of life or the history of the universe, abduction is the methodology that people apply to understanding the past.
Wait, I think you're going off on a tangent here. You're losing me. So again, I'm still on the point of starting point of knowledge. My starting point of knowledge is not arbitrary.
I'm saying that the starting point of knowledge requires some kind of epistemic tool, some kind of logical tool that you use to investigate the things that are beyond our ability to bring into the laboratory. History of the universe, history of the cosmos, and where I think we differentiate, Tom, where we disagree, is our epistemic starting points.
Well, right, that's what I'm asking. So I'm still totally lost here. So my epistemic starting point is I think, therefore I am. This is a necessary truth. It can, with 100% certainty, differentiate imagination from reality. Where is yours that can do this?
So this is the problem that I have. That you, as an individual, have made this large-scale claim that you, as Tom, can differentiate between imagination and reality, and then pronounce what is and is not part of reality. And that's where I think that the individual, your individual epistemology is not sufficient to contain the whole of reality, Tom.
Okay,
that's
so
the problem.
I didn't say any of that. I didn't say
don't see that you have access to that.
So just let's I can demonstrate this. Let's just start at the beginning. So here's my starting point. I think, therefore I am. It's necessary. It can differentiate imagination from reality. Where is yours? If yours can't, then mine's automatically better than yours because it's on the first step.
Well, there it is. There it is. The assumption right there that you're just telling me that mine can't.
No. I'm asking, can yours do it? Because if it can't, then mine is by definition better.
Well, you are still making that determination. And from our conversations, I think you find my epistemology inadequate.
Wait. No, this was something we agreed on. We agree there is a difference between imagination and reality. So we agree that to have an effective epistemology, you need to be able to differentiate between the two. Mine definitely can. Like, I can't think, therefore I am, and not am. That doesn't make sense. But how does yours accomplish the same thing? Because mine definitely can in this starting point case.
Well, and that's where I think we differ. That I could say that I could differentiate, that my mind can determine what differentiates imagination from reality. And my standard is not finally myself, Tom. That's where we differ. That my standard is not my own thinking about reality, but someone who actually is the creator of reality. And that's where I think that we differ.
Right. No, so I agree that's where we differ. And so I'm asking you, how does your methodology of starting with something outside of yourself differentiate imagination from reality? Mine definitely does. Mine, like, if you could give me an example of how mine could not do it, I'd be very impressed. But I'm saying your example of where I start with Jesus is the truth. Well, okay, I can just use the same method. The spaghetti monster is the truth. So I can clearly list an imaginary thing that can use the same method and be justified using your methodology. Therefore, your methodology cannot differentiate imagination from reality. But mine, you can't give an example because you can't give an example of a thing that thinks and doesn't exist.
Well, I'm not denying your existence. What I'm saying is that you, by your own standards, Tom, you cannot justify your own existence to anyone else but yourself.
That wasn't the premise of my argument, so I don't need to.
But that's the problem with your epistemology.
That's not a problem. I didn't.
Yourself right off the bat.
You can't say it's a problem if it's literally not one of the premises. Like if you say argument one, premise 2, premise 3. Well, there's a problem you didn't list in the argument. That's not in the argument, so you can't criticize something not in the argument.
No, but the beginning starting point is very important for how you've arrived at the conclusions that you do.
I think therefore I am.
So go ahead.
That's the starting point. I think therefore I am. Like what? How does that relate to your objection there?
It relates in the fact that you can't, with your own novel testable prediction concept, cannot demonstrate your own personal experiences or concepts of reality to anyone else but yourself.
Why? I don't know why you keep saying that, because I never claimed to be able to.
You're trying to apply your own idea of reality to mine.
No. So again, we're not nearly that far down the argument hole yet. We're just at this one part. Here is the starting point for knowledge. I didn't say anything about novel testable predictions yet. Not a thing. All I've said is I think therefore I am. I exist. That is a good starting point. That is not
understand
circular.
that. I understand. I
so now I'm looking for your starting point that is equivalent to that can do the same thing.
Well, Jesus says in John 8:58, I am. And so he is the creator of the universe and knows more about reality than either of us do.
Okay. So if we compare these two starting points, like my starting point is I think therefore I am, and you can never give an example of someone thinking and not existing. That's not possible. But I can give an example of Harry Potter said in book 7 of J.K. Rowling's thing, I am the way. Like, well, clearly that method of some person said something doesn't differentiate imagination from reality. It can get you false positives. Mine can't, yours can, so that does not seem to work.
I don't know how you think you're exempt from creating false positives or a psychology that gives you a sense that this feels good to you, and so therefore psychologically you've made this up for yourself.
How can I think therefore I am get a false positive?
Well, in terms of your concept of reality, if you want to just
I didn't say anything about reality. I said, how does I think therefore I am? That is my full methodology. I think therefore I am. How does that give a false positive?
You can be self-deceived very simply.
How can I deceive myself into not existing? Like, how can I believe I exist and be wrong? How is that possible?
I'm not talking about your physical existence. I'm talking about the whole person of who you are, Tom.
I don't care if I'm physical or if I'm idealistic or if I'm a combination of both. Tell me how I can think I exist and be wrong. How can I get a false positive? Because a positive means you believe something to be true. So I believe I exist. How can I have a false positive belief that I exist? How is that possible?
Let's go back to what we talked about last time. Sean Carroll affirming Everett's many worlds hypothesis. And consider that the mathematics tells him, and he affirms it, though he doesn't spend a whole lot of time with it, that if the universe, our universe, is just a quantum fluctuation of some kind, that the mathematics of quantum theory tell him, and told Everett back in the 50s, that there are a possible many worlds out there in which there are a multitude of Tom jumps.
You've totally lost me.
Okay, are you familiar with Everett's many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics?
Yes, but
okay.
So just using that example.
What does the math yield? What is Sean Carroll affirming in Everett's quantum mechanic theory?
The math in the many worlds hypothesis is that combining the vacuum energy in space and early universes, Guth inflation, you get a combination of an infinitely expanding amount of universes that are all existing, and you get one of every possible variation.
Right.
But again, so in every one of those cases, every me in that case who believes I exist is going to be right every single time. That can't get a false positive.
No, what you have are individuals who think they exist. And you're talking about ontology and existence. What does it mean to exist in multiple universes and multiple arenas? How do you actually know that you really finally exist?
If they think how can they think they exist and not exist?
Well, you could be a brain in a Boltzmann brain universe.
If a Boltzmann brain is thinking, then the Boltzmann brain exists.
Well, it could be thinking can be an illusion. It can be illusory. That's what Boltzmann did. That's what he thought, that your brain is projecting an illusion of existence, not actual existence.
No, you can't project an illusion. How do you have if you have an illusion? To have an illusion, you have to exist to have the illusion. You can't have an illusion of existence and not exist and have the illusion of existence. So,
well, how do you demonstrate that you exist? How do you do that?
I think,
in your worldview, how do you demonstrate that you exist? To me, not just to yourself. But
I don't need to. So again, my methodology, I think, therefore I am, cannot demonstrate a false positive, cannot result in a false positive.
You're just telling me that. You don't actually demonstrate that you actually exist in a physical sense.
I'm not trying to. I don't need to. So that's not the point. The point here is, can the methodology create a false positive, yes or no? If it can create a false positive, then it cannot differentiate imagination from reality. If it's logically impossible for it to create a false positive, then it can. So that's the question.
I still think that you cannot finally demonstrate that you really exist as you think you do.
I didn't say I think I exist in any kind of way. I just said I exist. I don't care in what way I exist. I could be a brain in a vat. I still exist. I could be in the Matrix. I still exist. I could be
exactly my point.
And so none of that was in a part of my point. So again, my point is I exist. That's the conclusion. I don't care how I exist. That's not a part of the argument. Nowhere in my argument does I say I exist as a physical being or I exist not in the Matrix. I don't care about any of that. That's not a part of my method. My method is simply I think, therefore I am. So how can just that with nothing else, no other premises, no other conclusions, no other assumptions or presumptions about reality, just I think, therefore I am, full stop, how can that one sentence get a false positive?
Because you're the only person that actually can confirm that.
How can that get a false positive? Whether or not the number of people who confirm it doesn't make a difference.
According to your standards, Tom, that's a non-falsifiable position to hold.
I never said anything about falsifiability. I never said anything about testability. I said, how can that get a false positive?
Predictions about your existence.
I never said anything about novel testable predictions here. I said, how could that get a false positive?
Yeah, I mean, that's your concept.
No. Again, so I'm starting at the beginning here. The beginning of the absolute.
That novel testable predictions are what you require that for something to count as evidence.
No. That's later. That's much later. That's much later in the epistemology.
Full stop on your I think, therefore I am. Then what you need to do to be consistent in your logic about your own existence is provide novel testable.
Right. So I've already explained to you that is false. I do not need that. Because the starting point,
because otherwise you're just
no. I never said again. You keep confusing. You keep trying to add in things I haven't added to the argument yet. So my full argument, I've said nothing about novel testable predictions. This is the very beginning of my epistemology. I think, therefore I am. There is nothing about novel testable predictions. I haven't mentioned them. It's not a premise of my argument. You can't bring them up. You can't bring them as a criticism because they're not in there. The full beginning point of my argument is I think, therefore I am. How can that method get a false positive?
Again, self-deception, delusion, it's in the psychology literature. It's not meeting your standards of novel testable predictions.
Again, you can't bring that up. I haven't brought that in as a premise. So that isn't, you cannot bring that up.
It's valid to what you're saying, Tom, because you want to establish your existence as being true and real. But I'm saying by your own standards, you can't do that.
That's not a standard. I haven't brought that up as a standard yet.
Well, that's how you began it. You talk about what counts as evidence. And I'm saying, well, your existence, if you want it to count for evidence, you will have to apply novel testable predictions to your I think, therefore I am.
No, again, so I haven't brought up novel testable predictions. I have not said it yet. So this is, again, we're starting from scratch here. I've said nothing. This is the first premise of the argument. I think, therefore I am. Novel testable predictions, none of those words are in there, so you can't bring them up as a criticism. How can this method get a false positive? Just I think, therefore I am. There are no testable predictions here. It's just I think, therefore I am. So you can't bring up novel testable predictions.
It's bordering on solipsism, Tom.
Well, yeah, it is solipsism, but that's the starting point. So how can that be wrong?
So that's the point right there. That solipsism
What?
is absolutely, it's incoherent.
No, it's not. It's epistemic solipsism. It means that's the starting point of knowledge. So it has nothing to do. It doesn't say there is or isn't other things in the universe. It just says here's the first thing we can know. This is the ground of knowledge. It can't produce a false positive. It can differentiate imagination from reality as a starting point. Your worldview can't. Mine is better than your worldview.
Yeah, when all of you say is that I think therefore I am full stop, and then tell me that my worldview.
No. I'm not telling you that. So again, this is the beginning of my argument. This is just the first premise of my entire epistemology, which is a big long 500-page book. This is the starting point. So my starting point is I think therefore I am. This is a necessary truth. It can differentiate imagination from reality. It doesn't get it wrong. How can yours? Can your worldview do this? Because mine can.
Well, you're saying I can't be wrong. I mean, how is that? That's completely internal and subjective to yourself. I can't be wrong, and you can't you don't have a novel testable prediction to show that
you can't bring up novel testable predictions because that's not a premise.
So again, just prohibiting you're prohibiting your own standards from being used on your own epistemology.
No. So again, this is the beginning of my epistemology. The first part
which requires novel testable predictions in order to be evidence for something.
Wrong. The novel testable predictions comes much later in the argument as a conclusion based on lots
of
Use
it on yourself. Use novel testable predictions on your own example.
Because that doesn't come until later. That doesn't come until later. The starting point is I think therefore I am. The starting point is not novel testable predictions. I don't just pick novel testable predictions and say I'm going to start with this. That is not a presupposition. It is not an assumption. That means there's lots of other stuff behind it that justifies that conclusion. Like I said, there are no presuppositions in my argument. So I don't just start with pick a random premise like novel testable predictions. That doesn't work. I agree that would be dumb if I just picked novel testable predictions.
You're just picking yourself, and you think that your existence is justifying your own standards about what counts as evidence for other things. I'm picking myself because I exist. It is literally not something I get a choice in. Well, what if I said I pick myself, I exist, therefore everything that I say can't possibly be wrong either?
Well, that wouldn't work, but that would work as a starting point that you exist. That's a non-arbitrary starting point. Then you'd have to use that and get more premises to lead up to the things you're saying. That would be fine. That's perfectly reasonable. But you can't just say, I think therefore I am, therefore everything I'm saying is true, which is not what I'm saying at all. I never said that. I said, here, I think therefore I am is a good starting point for knowledge, which is non-arbitrary. It doesn't result from false positives. It is true. It will always get the correct answer. That's the point. It's not.
No, I think the false positives are where you and I disagree, because you can be, as you said earlier, you can experience delusion or self-deception.
How can I have a delusion that I exist and not exist? Explain.
What is the ground of your existence, Tom?
I don't care. It doesn't matter what the ground of my existence is. All that matters is if I exist. It absolutely does, because according to science, that you're just particles. I never said anything about that. None of that was in anything I said. So again,
I mean, how do you know that your intellect and the language that you've made up in your own existence is actually a standard for measuring what is true about reality?
I never said it was. No, that's not a part of my argument either. So again, my question.
Well, it is when you're making the claims that we've been making. It is part of your epistemology. Nope. It is part of your assumptions.
Nope, that was never a part. So again, in order to critique an argument, you got to go with just the premises of the argument. You can't bring in extra stuff that's not there. The premise of my argument is I think therefore I am. So you'd have to demonstrate how that premise is false.
Well, you can't demonstrate that it's true. So you have to accept it. What I said several minutes ago, you have to accept a premise that you can't finally test about.
So if you're arguing that I'm wrong, that I'm not experiencing my own existence right here, you're a crazy person. So that you cannot.
I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying by your own standards, you cannot justify your existence by your own standards.
I think therefore I am. If that statement is true, I've justified my own existence.
Well, again, that's to yourself. But
I never said I could. Again, so why do you keep saying that? That doesn't help your argument at all. So it doesn't matter.
I think the source of your origin of your epistemology is important for everything else that you say in the discussion. I believe
the source is the fact that I exist. So how I exist doesn't matter to my argument. I don't care if I'm a matter.
Sure, it does, because how you exist, where you came from, your origins, how you understand language, how you understand mathematics, how you understand reality, if it's created or uncreated.
Makes no difference.
All of that points back to the foundational idea of who you are and what you think, or who you think you are, how you think you exist.
Like, none of that can change the statement I said. I think therefore I am. None of it can make it true. None of it can make it false. It's always going to be the same. It's ontology independent. It doesn't matter what you put in for the ontology, whether we're created by God, whether we're created by matter. It's always going to get the same result. I think therefore I am is still going to be true. That's why it's a good starting point, because none of that stuff you listed matters.
Well, that's where we differentiate. It does matter.
Okay, so
I think it does.
that's what
And
I'm
we're
asking.
not going to solve it. I mean,
No,
I don't.
no, no,
I
no.
don't
That
wanna
this,
keep
you
going
keep
around and
saying
around,
that.
but
You keep saying that, but you've demonstrated nothing. Like, demonstrate to me how changing any of those variables you listed can make I think, therefore I am false. How can I think I exist and not exist?
because how do you define who you are?
I don't
How,
need to define
you're
who I
only,
am. I'm just defining I exist, not who I am.
but your existence is predicated upon it's a circular internal subjective idea of your existence that
No,
you
no,
have
it's
not
literally a direct
demonstrated.
experience. The thinking is the experience. There's no, I don't care if I'm
But you
physical. I
can't
don't care
prove
if
that to
I'm,
anybody else but yourself.
again, doesn't make a difference. None of that. I don't know why you keep saying that. That doesn't help
It
your
does make a
argument.
difference. I think it does. I don't think we're going to solve it here, but so we could go
how
on.
does that make a difference? Like, how does change? You can change who I am, however you want. Go for it. Feel free. Knock yourself out. I'm still going to be right every time I say I think, therefore I am.
Well, your I'm going to be right is a subjective internal conclusion that you've reached for yourself that you cannot, by your own standards, demonstrate to be true.
Okay, if you're right about that, then demonstrate that changing that in any way can make my statement false. Change something about anything about how I exist to make my statement false.
Well, it's not that I'm trying to say that it's false. I'm saying that your statement is internally consistent to yourself, but it doesn't demonstrate that you actually exist.
Okay, so take whatever you said, whatever you want, whatever premises, whatever objectification you want, and make my statement false. Because if you can't, then I'm right, and
I'm not. My objective is not to make your statement false.
Well, that's what I'm claiming. I'm claiming you can't. It doesn't matter what you do. You can never make my statement false because my statement is a necessary truth. That makes it a good starting point.
Yeah. So your starting point is determining that my starting point is not allowable.
No, my starting point didn't say anything about that. My starting point said, here is a good starting point.
Yeah, you said I can't use Jesus as a starting point.
No, I didn't say that at all. I said, here's my starting point. I think, therefore I am. Now you demonstrate your starting point that can do the same thing, that has the same.
And my starting point was Jesus says he's the I am and the creator. And that's where I begin.
Yes,
I don't begin with myself.
That's perfect.
I am contingent upon.
Perfect. So now we have your starting point is Jesus. My starting point is I think, therefore I am. Now I'm going to take your worldview and demonstrate it's false by using the same method to show a false conclusion, show a false positive.
Let me pause there. And here's the problem that I think we're having that I think is a problematic for your worldview. You would have to be an omniscient being to know that an omniscient being does not exist.
I never said it didn't exist, so that wasn't a part of my argument.
Well,
my argument
to say that there's no evidence, to say that Jesus isn't God, to say that
nope, I never said any of that. Never said any of that. So my argument is, here's your method. Your method is I start with Jesus. Jesus is the truth. I start with Harry Potter. Harry Potter is the truth. I can use the same method and get a false positive. So that method that you used led to a false positive. Now, so I know Harry Potter doesn't exist, or we can be reasonably conclude Harry Potter doesn't exist, or I can just say square circle if you want. We can go with square circle. The square circle is the truth. So I can use your method to get a false positive very, very easily. It's very easy to demonstrate your method leads to a false positive. Now, if my method is as bad as yours, you would need to be able to do the same thing to my method that I just did to yours.
Well, why can't Jesus say the same thing you're saying and say, I am, therefore I exist?
He could. He's perfectly fine with that. That would be a great starting point for Jesus.
Well, how do you know he has not done that? I mean, you're coming at it as though
I'm saying you haven't done that. I'm not saying he hasn't done that. I'm saying you haven't done that.
I'm not following you.
So
what do you mean I haven't done that?
My starting point is I think, therefore I am. Your
starting
point
God could say the same thing about his starting point.
Yeah, God can definitely do that.
So how does your I am, how is your I am capable of judging his same basic I am? It seems the competition of I am
justifiable too. So my I think therefore I am would be justifiable, and his I think therefore I am would also be justifiable, and so is yours, and so it's literally everyone who thinks therefore they are would all be justifiable to use that as a starting point because that's a good starting point. But using someone else as a starting point doesn't work, and I can demonstrate that because it leads to false positives.
So you're saying using somebody else as a starting point for one's epistemology leads to false positives and therefore is unreliable.
Yes.
Where did that come from?
Where did what come from?
Where did you get that assumption from?
It's not an assumption. I can demonstrate it. So, for example, I can say, you believe in X created the universe or whatever. I can say, I believe in not X created the universe. Both of those can't be true. Logical contradiction thing. So we know that that method leads to a false positive. One of those two statements is going to be false. So one of them is a false positive. No, but you can't do that for mine.
Because false positives don't eliminate one of the other explanations.
Right. This is not a proof that there is no God. That's not what this is.
I know that. I know you're not trying to prove it. I'm just saying that a false positive does not negate a starting point.
Yes, it does. If your starting point can't differentiate between which one is the false positive and which one is not the false positive.
Back to this idea of people being self-deceived and experiencing hallucinations and being deluded. Your statement that I think, therefore I am, is subjective to that very problem. That you created a system or a foundation for understanding reality that is rooted and grounded finally in yourself.
So I've already asked for this. If you're right, demonstrate it. Demonstrate how my statement, I think, therefore I am, can lead to a false positive using delusions, illusions, hallucinations, whatever you want. Demonstrate how that statement can get a false positive. Let's grant that you're right. Let's say, okay, it does have that problem. Show me. Show me how I think therefore I am can get a false positive.
In Hugh Everett's Many Worlds interpretation, there's a TJump in another universe doing something completely different. Which one of you is the real TJump?
Both. What? Anything that thinking exists.
How do you know that you're him and he's you? How do you know that?
Again, so existence is just the thinking. So it doesn't matter if I'm thinking or he's thinking. They're both thinking. They both exist. Anything that does thinking is existing.
But what if in one alternative many worlds, you're thinking in logically contradictory ways to the way in which you're thinking now? Which one of you is right?
They're both right. If they're both thinking and they both think they
wait
exist.
A minute, hold on a second. No, because the other Tom is not.
So remember, just to clarify, the argument is I think therefore I am. That statement has to lead to a false positive. So if the person in the other universe is saying I think therefore I don't am, or I don't think therefore I not am, or something, then that would not be my statement. I think therefore I am. That would be the opposite of my statement.
What if you don't exist in another you're dead in another world?
That would be fine too. I would not be thinking in that world.
That's contrary. Which one of you is the real existing person? If one of you is dead and one of you is alive,
there's no
one of you is telling the truth?
Doesn't matter how many TJumps there are. If anything is thinking, that thing that is thinking exists. Now I'm going to call myself TJump because I like it. I don't care. It doesn't matter how many TJumps there are. They're all going to be the real one. If they're thinking, they exist, and that's all the only requirement here. No other properties are required. Just the thinking. That's it.
But your other thinking TJumps in other universes may be producing false positives that you can't verify or justify.
What's the false positive? What's the false positive?
The false positive is that you might be in another universe, existing as thinking in completely different terms, or maybe your thinking is merely an illusion. You're in a matrix or a hologram. In one other universe, you're programmed to feel like you're thinking. And so you're not really thinking. You're just programmed to feel like you're thinking. You're experiencing a hallucination of thought, which you could be in this universe. You can't differentiate with your I think therefore I am, and not demonstrate that you're not a thinking pre-programmed blip in a matrix. You can't demonstrate that you're not. And so there's a potential for false positives there on the idea of quantum many worlds.
So thinking is just any experience at all. It's just qualia. That's it. Doesn't matter if it's programmed. Doesn't matter if it's determined. It's just any qualia experience at all. That's thinking.
So in another world, you could be pre-programmed to feel like you're thinking, or you could be experiencing an illusion of thought. That doesn't mean you exist.
So any feeling, anything at all, that is thinking. So any qualia experience.
Do Sims characters actually experience thought?
No.
Okay, so you could be a Sims character in another universe. How do you know?
If a Sims character thinks they exist, then they're experiencing the thought of existing.
So do they really exist in reality?
If they experience thought, yes.
But do they experience thought?
No.
No, so you could be a Sims character in another universe, not experiencing thought and not existing. Therefore, there's a false positive in your statement.
No. How could I experience a thought of existing while not existing? That's literally a contradiction.
You're experiencing an illusion, a hallucination of thought.
Experience is thought. So if I'm experiencing, if
What if you're pre-programmed like a Sims character in a Matrix?
So if there's any part of the sentence that says I'm experiencing, that's an experience. That experience and thought synonyms here. So if I'm experiencing X, then I have to exist because that experience and thinking are synonymous.
As a programmed character in the Matrix, how do you know that's real?
If I'm experiencing it, I can't be experiencing it and not exist.
I still don't think that you've extracted yourself from the problem of being a program who is hallucinating experience.
Oh God. So it's impossible to have qualia experience and not have qualia experience at the same time, right?
Well, again, computer program, AI, Matrix, Sean Carroll and Max Tegmark were discussing this on a podcast recently.
They both agree with me on this. This is just Descartes, I think, therefore I am cognitive, I assume. They 100% agree with me on this. So that's not going to help you.
Well, the theoretical abstraction of modern cosmology going in the direction that our universe is a computer
every single
simulation.
part of that all agrees with my argument here. So no one in physics disagrees with me on this one. I've spoken to Sean Carroll. This is not a thing. There's no disagreement about this. This is just straight up P or not P. So if you have an qualia experience, you can't not have a qualia experience. Those are.
But how do you differentiate that from being a program in a matrix in an alternate universe? How can you prove that or disprove that or show that you actually demonstrate that you have genuine, authentic qualia in this universe? And what I'm saying, Tom, is that you cannot demonstrate that to anyone else but yourself.
Again, so you keep missing the point here completely. Like, can you exist and not exist at the same time?
And again, I'm asking you to define ontological existence and demonstrate that it's not a matrix or a brain in a vat. You can't do that. You have no conceptual means.
Again, you've said nothing. You've said nothing there at all that is relevant to my point. So existence, if you exist in the matrix, you exist. If you exist in the brain in a vat, you exist. If you exist as a program,
character exist in a computer program, Tom. You seem to be unable to say whether or not a Sims character actually exists.
No, I've already answered that. If they have qualia experience, they exist. If they don't have qualia experience, they do not exist.
And if you're a Sims character, how do you know if you are or not a Sims character in a matrix?
If I have qualia experience, then I exist. That's how you know.
But it's a simulation or a hallucination of existence, not actual.
If it's a simulation of me existing, then I exist. So if I exist and have a simulation, I exist. That's the point. So anything, if it's a hallucination, if I'm experiencing a hallucination, I have to exist to experience the hallucination. If I'm a brain in the vat, I have to exist as a brain in the vat to experience the hallucination. If I'm in the matrix,
you cannot differentiate between those
which
options.
Doesn't matter to the argument because I exist in every single one of them.
Because if you're just a hallucination,
I exist in all of those. If I exist in the matrix, I exist in the brain in the vat, I exist in the Sims, I exist in all of those. There's not a difference for the argument.
Well, it is absolutely foundational for what you're attempting to say about anything else.
No, it's not. None of that said anything. Absolutely. None of my premises had anything else.
You're just assuming it's not.
No. Again, so we're just going with the first premise of the argument here. I think, therefore I am. This is a good grounds of knowledge. I've said nothing further. Like all of the other premises that lead to novel testable predictions in science, all of that would come later, and I can justify all of that too. But we're just going with the first premise here. I think, therefore I am is a good, non-circular starting point of knowledge that is necessarily true and can't get it wrong. It cannot produce a false positive. Yours clearly can, mine clearly can't, and you keep saying it can, but you've demonstrated 0 cases where you get a false positive.
Well, that's where we disagree. And I think based on the material science, you cannot finally demonstrate that your existence is what you say it is.
That's not a false positive. So again, you're just playing with the definition of false positive to make it mean something it doesn't mean. A false positive means I believe I exist and I'm wrong. I positive belief I exist, I get it wrong.
You could be just a brain in a vat, which in terms of existence. See, the elasticity of your term of existence is the problem.
There is no elasticity. Any quality experience is existence. So if you experience it, you exist by definition.
In a purely materialistic worldview, that ontology of existence is a tricky thing.
No, it's not. I didn't say anything about a materialistic worldview. That was not in my premise. So my premise is I think, therefore I am. That's it, period. Doesn't matter if the world's physical, doesn't matter if it's idealistic, doesn't matter if it's dualistic. You get the same result in every single one of them.
I'll grant your existence and we can move on.
Well, no, this this is the problem, is that my worldview works extremely well here. I get a necessary starting point. That's a great basis for knowledge. You have a circular starting point that is arbitrary, and you can pick whatever you want and you get exactly the same thing. So it can't differentiate. You get false positives.
We disagree. I think your worldview, given materialism, can produce false positives. You cannot demonstrate what kind of existence that you finally have.
Do you not realize why that's completely gibberish to my argument? Like, that does nothing. That just proves I'm right.
No, there are different levels of existence. A Sims,
which was never a part of my argument.
Simulation. There are a multitude of different possibilities that your statement cannot differentiate. There are different types of existence,
and it can't differentiate between apples and oranges either. But it doesn't claim to, so that's not relevant to the argument. So again,
it is. Because you want to make pronouncements about what's real and true and testable.
Nope. Again, you keep deflecting to try and save your broken worldview here, which I've proven is false.
I'm saying that there's nothing in your worldview that actually can differentiate between what kind of existence.
I didn't say it has yet. So again, we're starting with premise one. I think, therefore I am. That's all. The only thing I need to differentiate.
I will grant you existence so that we could move on to the
right.
To the
so
next.
I can differentiate. I can say I exist and not produce a false positive. You can't.
I can differentiate as well. I just have a different standard of truth by which I do.
How does because I've demonstrated yours doesn't work, and you can't demonstrate mine doesn't work.
You've demonstrated that mine doesn't work, but you have not sufficiently demonstrated that your own existence is a sufficient and necessary condition to judge mine.
Because I didn't say it was. I never said it was. So that wasn't the part of my argument. I don't need to do that.
You are saying in an objective sense that I'm wrong. And I'm saying that your concept of your own existence is questionable from the start. And so that your pronouncements about my own epistemology have no bearing until you can establish that you are legitimately existing by your own empirical, verifiable, testable, novel prediction standards.
Right, and absolutely all of that is gibberish, because none of that actually affects my argument at all. So again, I don't think you understand how arguments and evidence work here. Like, all I need to do is say just the starting point of our worldviews. My starting point is a necessary truth that can't be wrong. Yours is a arbitrary truth that can be wrong.
And you haven't extracted yourself from the problem of hard solipsism.
I haven't needed to yet, because we're only at the first premise yet. That's later on, much later on in the later premises. We're still at the first premise.
And I think the starting point is absolutely axiomatic to the rest of the discussion.
That's why we're starting with the first premise. That's the starting point.
Yeah, I will grant you that you exist and we can move on.
Okay, so you grant my methodology starts with a necessary truth that cannot produce a false positive. Yours does not.
I disagree that it can't produce a false positive.
Right, and this is the part where I'm trying to understand you, because you've presented no cases of that. Like, a false positive means...
Yes, I have. I've shown through the mathematics of modern cosmology that you could in fact be an artificial...
None of those are false positives. None of those are false positives, because again, a false positive is to have a belief I exist and to not exist. That would be a false positive. So you have to give an example.
Term of existence is elastic. You can't determine.
Nope, my term of existence is not elastic. The term is thinking. The thinking is existence. If you have a thought, you exist.
It doesn't matter that if you cannot differentiate in terms of what kind of ontology, qualia, or existence that you have, that is relevant to everything else that you want to tell me about.
No, it's not.
reality.
No, it's not. So again, that does not apply to my argument. That's a straw man. That's straw man gibberish. So my argument is I think, therefore I am. And that method can't produce a false positive. That method cannot produce a thought that I exist.
Yeah, I believe that it can't, but I disagree. So we'll move on.
No, this is kind of like I win. I've already won the argument at this point. I've destroyed your worldview completely, because this is so obviously true. The problem here is that if my method of starting cannot produce a false positive, it cannot produce a thought that I exist while not existing, then it is a good, necessary starting point, and it's better than yours, because
your term of existence is too elastic.
I've already disproved that.
Novel testable predictions that it's accurate.
Again, you keep jumping to like premise number 47, which is not anything I've brought up yet. So my premise
your own logic, you won't apply your own epistemic logic to your own existence.
I'm doing that right now. So again, since as I admitted,
testable predictions about your own existence.
As I said earlier, novel testable predictions is not a presupposition. It's not an assumption, which means it's based on other things. There are things before it. So you don't apply novel testable predictions to the things before it, because then it would be a presupposition. So it's a conclusion based off of other premises that come first. The starting premise is I think, therefore I am. So I think, therefore I am is before novel testable predictions, not after. You don't apply novel testable predictions to the thing. No, this is what it starts with. There's nothing prior to this. This is the starting point. So I don't apply novel testable predictions to this. This is the starting point. I think, therefore I am. So that is the one thing. that this starting point does not have a false positive. You cannot produce a false positive. There is no ambiguity to exist. Exist is just I think. Any thought, any experience, anything of that sort is existence. Doesn't matter if you're a brain in a vat and you think, okay, you exist. If you're in the Matrix and you think, you exist. If you're a Sims character and you think, you exist. Any thinking is existence. So I don't need to differentiate between any of those because they all exist. And none of those are, and whether or not you exist in any of those doesn't change the argument. So it doesn't make the argument false. So it doesn't produce a false positive, proving I'm correct in each of those cases. If I'm in the brain in the vat.
Each case of existence is radically different.
But it doesn't.
And it really depends on your statements when you talk about reality.
No, it doesn't.
It does, because you're assuming that you exist in a certain state.
No, I didn't. I nowhere in that premise did it say I exist in a certain state.
The kind of existence that you have is absolutely dependent upon.
No.
Foundational to what you say about
where in I think therefore I am does it tell me what kind of way I exist?
Exactly, it can't.
It doesn't. It doesn't attempt to. So saying it can't is like,
because that if you don't think
again, this is the starting point. So the starting point is I think therefore I am. This is my epistemology. I get to define it however I want. You need to show a problem with this premise, or you need to grant this premise is a necessary starting point that cannot lead to a false positive. Those are the two options. Either it's a flawed in some way.
No, that's a false dichotomy, because you're starting with yourself. It does not define what kind of reality in which you exist. It just assumes.
Nowhere did I say it did, so that doesn't relevant. That's not relevant to anything.
It is relevant, because if you think reality is uncreated,
I never said that. I never said that. Never said that.
You need to make that distinction, Tom, for your statements about reality to make sense.
No, I don't. None of that I said in the first premise. So again, you keep bringing up things that are like premise 47, premise 23, premise 84. Like none of that is in the first premise, so none of that is relevant yet. You can't bring that in as a criticism. You got to start with the first premise. If you can't, either there's something wrong with the first premise, or there is not something wrong with the first premise. Those are the only two options. It's P or not P. It is a true
dichotomy. I don't agree. There's a lot wrong with your first premise.
Okay. So that's not a false dichotomy. So it's a dichotomy.
It is, because you're defining what existence is.
Either there is something wrong with the first premise, or there is not something wrong with the first premise. That is P.
And I think there is something wrong with your first premise. That's
great. That is good. So we're making progress. What is wrong with the first premise? I think, therefore I am. Existence is just any thinking. So it doesn't care what kind.
You're too elastic and too ambiguous with existence. That's my problem.
That doesn't make a difference. That's not a problem. How is that a problem? It does,
because you're going to make further arguments based on this idea of your existence.
What?
You're going to make arguments based on this premise of your own existence, and you haven't defined what kind of existence that you have.
I don't need to. Like, well, I don't know. Like, I haven't told you what an apple or an orange is either. I don't need to. Like, I don't know why you keep bringing this up.
You can't show to anyone else but yourself.
I don't know why you keep bringing this up. How is this a problem with the first premise?
If you cannot demonstrate through your own methodology your existence, why should I believe anything else that you have to say about reality?
How is this a problem with the first premise? So the first premise is I think therefore I am. Where is the problem in that? Saying that existence is the problem because of further premises isn't a problem with the first premise. It's a problem with the further premises.
Yeah, the foundational aspect of your idea of existence, that you think you exist, and it doesn't matter how you think you exist, right?
Yet. So the first premise doesn't
matter how you exist. And you want to make pronouncements about my own epistemology and ontology. I'm going to challenge
you keep
your concept of reality.
Keep jumping into nonsense that has nothing to do with what I said. So again, first premise, I think, therefore I am. You can't bring up further premises and say there's a problem with the further premises. That would be a problem with the further premises. So this premise, there has to be a problem with this premise on its own with nothing else related.
Your idea of existence is ambiguous, Tom.
Your idea of existence is ambiguous. Why is that a problem?
You can't define it for anybody else but yourself.
Why is that a problem? How is that a problem? Where is that a problem with the first premise? Does the first premise contradict itself?
Individual able to make pronouncements about reality, reason, logic, made-up language.
Where does it do that in the first premise? Where does it do any of that in the first premise?
Your own existence cannot be demonstrated to anybody else.
Where does it attempt to
do
that in
the first premise? Everything, your interpretations, your imaginary constructs, your standards.
You keep saying that. Where in the first premise does it attempt to do that? If it doesn't attempt to do that, then it's not a contradiction. It's not a problem. So it can only be a problem.
You're making assumptions about your existence.
Where in the first premise?
that has a bearing on reality about what you say about everything else.
Where in the first premise is the problem? That's the problem. You keep saying this is a problem, but you demonstrate no problem.
The ambiguity of your concept of existence in ontology.
Where is that a problem in the first premise? Like, how does that create a contradiction
say that
in the first premise?
You can't produce false positives, that you can't be wrong,
right?
and indeed, but you haven't demonstrated by just saying I exist, therefore I am, that you haven't demonstrated anything. You've just made this statement to yourself and to me, but you haven't demonstrated that you exist. Really, fundamentally, philosophically, metaphysically, you're saying you exist to yourself, but again, it's very solipsistic. And but for the sake of argument, I'll grant that you exist, but I think it's potentially.
This is kind of the main point here. So I mean, everyone can see how obvious this is, that my worldview is totally better than yours in this case, because it's just saying that I think, therefore I am. Whatever way I exist, I don't care how I exist. Brain in a vat, matrix, Sims, doesn't make a difference. If I think, that thinking exists. And so that's good enough. That's a solid, necessary truth starting point. And there's nothing in that premise that has an issue at all. And you keep saying there's an issue, but you haven't demonstrated. You just keep saying there's further issues of other stuff that you haven't mentioned.
You build the arguments from there about my ontology and my epistemology.
Stop. Build the arguments from there means there's stuff in the future that I haven't mentioned yet, and you're critiquing that stuff. But you're not critiquing the thing in the first premise. So that isn't a problem with the first premise. You can say there's problems with the further premise. Like if I say premise 1, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore John is a mortal. Well, clearly there's a problem with the third premise because I haven't mentioned John in the argument yet. But you can't say that's a problem with the first premise. It doesn't work. So again, the first premise is just I think, therefore I am. And you keep saying there's a problem with just that part. And the problem you keep mentioning has to do with things I haven't mentioned yet. So it's just like saying...
Again, I'll just stick with the definition of existence and ontology in your first premise. What does that mean?
What does what mean?
Existence. What does that mean?
Thinking. Any thinking.
Right. So again, back to my earlier question: Are you a Sims thinking? Are you an AI? Are you a brain in a vat? What kind of thinking?
Those are all thinking. So those all fit into the same argument. So
a Sims character can think.
If it can think, I don't know if it can think or not.
Well, you just said if anybody. I mean, how do you know that? How do you know you're not a Sims character? Is what I'm asking, and you can't seem to be able to differentiate.
My first premise doesn't say Sims character. My first premise says thinking, therefore exist. So
does a Sims character think and exist?
If it thinks, then it exists. I don't know if it thinks or not. It doesn't matter to my argument. So if it does, then
how do you know if you're a Sims character or not?
Where is that in the first premise? That isn't in the first premise, is it? Where?
You're just assuming you're not.
I didn't assume I'm not. I never said that. That's not in the first premise.
So if you are a Sims character, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're AI or thinking. It doesn't matter. Everything is just thinking, and your thinking is enough to justify everything else.
My thinking is enough to justify that I exist. Yes. That's
to yourself.
That's the conclusion of the first premise. I think, therefore I exist.
But you want to make this conclusion objectively applicable to everything else that you wish to say, correct?
Nope. This is just about the only thing. It's just I think, therefore I am.
So you don't even. So that doesn't finally matter if you exist or not.
It's just the starting point. It's the starting point. That's what matters.
Right. You're assuming existence and not really defining it very well or thought very well. I don't know what you mean by thinking or existence. You haven't expanded upon that.
You know the term qualia? Like you Google.
Yes.
So it's qualia, experience, thinking.
But you can only demonstrate that to yourself, Tom. I can't experience your qualia. You can't prove you're having qualia.
Where in the first premise does it say I demonstrate it to anybody else?
Okay, so you're solipsistically beginning your epistemological argument.
So again, we're going back to the original question. Here's the first premise. Either there is a problem with the first premise or there is no problem with the first premise, and it is a good, necessary grounding. So those are the two options. Either it has a problem or it has no problem. So
yeah, it has a problem. It has definitional problems with thinking and ontology.
Where does it say anything about that ontology anywhere in it? About what?
Well, again, clearly, if you don't know what thinking is, or the definition is ambiguous, or you don't know what existence is, or that definition is ambiguous, given the many worlds and other possible interpretations of reality and existence, the ambiguity in your statement, Tom, does not give me confidence that you've demonstrated your existence. And that's fine. We can move on. I will grant you your existence in my own world.
I'm happy to keep going for this because it just demonstrates how superior my worldview is. I mean, I can just grant, yep, I think therefore I am pure necessarily truth, can't be wrong. I don't have to try and argue from nonsense gibberish that has nothing to do with the argument. I don't have to deflate to things that don't matter to the argument to try and deflect to things that change nothing about the argument. I can just grant this obvious truth that everyone in the audience is like, yep, that's obviously true. And the fact that you have to fight against one of the most obvious truths in the world to try and justify your worldview shows how inferior your worldview is. So I'm happy to sit on this point all day, every day with every single theist because I'm going to win every single time because it just makes my worldview so much obviously better.
Well, I don't see it as being obvious from your perspective, except to you.
Well, no, except to literally everyone. This is like saying,
I'm not going to, based on it, you know, the starting point of epistemology. I don't just accept it carte blanche that you exist without defining what you mean by existence and what you define what you mean by thinking.
Right, and that's, I mean, you can say that.
Say here, I think and I exist, and I understand that, and I will accept. I do accept that. But grounding that, Tom, is what you haven't done.
I don't need to, because none of that was in the first premise.
Your own standards, and then when I ask you by your own standards to justify that, you don't. You say you don't have to, and so that's where my
right, because that's difficult. You're asking for something I haven't tried to do. Like, so here's the starting point. Well, it doesn't do this other thing. Well, I don't need to do it the other thing. Like, you keep asking for something additional. 1 second, I gotta.
Yeah, you make exceptions for your own epistemology and your standards. I think.
Nope, I said I'm going to do exactly what I did, and I did it. That's the requirement. Asking me to do more stuff isn't relevant.
I started with Jesus in the same way.
Nope, I proved that false. But I got to be back. I'll be back in 1 minute.
Okay, all right.
Okay. All right, I'm back.
Okay.
I'm back. So I mean, it seems obvious to like anyone who watches this. Like, if you imagine a neutral party thinking about the two positions, one position says I think therefore I am, and this can't produce a false positive, and the only requirement is the thinking and the existence, literally nothing else. It doesn't matter if you're what kind of existence, it's irrelevant to the argument. So asking for it just doesn't do anything. It's like if you say,
well, I think
if you say Jesus is the truth, and I say, well, what is a tomato? I mean, you didn't answer what is a tomato with Jesus is the truth. So, but does that disprove your argument? Well, clearly not. So it doesn't have anything to do with the argument. So it's a non sequitur. It's literally bringing up something I didn't say. So it doesn't matter. And everyone can understand this. Like, it's super clear that I think therefore I am is necessarily true. Like, you can't exist and not exist at the same time. You can't have thoughts and not exist to have the thoughts, because that's literally what it means to exist, is to have thoughts. Doesn't matter what the thoughts are made of. Uh, so my grounding, just the first premise, is clearly superior to yours because mine can't produce a false positive by definition. But yours clearly can, because I can just use the same method to produce Harry Potter says he's the truth or whatever, or Circle says he's the truth or whatever. And so it's hard for me to understand why you don't see this as so clearly obvious when it's literally designed to be the most obvious thing in the world. It's hard for me to understand.
Yeah,
why
there's
you
a
don't
lot
get
of
this.
there's a lot of difficulty that has arisen from Cartesian epistemology.
Not in the first
in
premise,
terms of-
there hasn't. So the first premise isn't where the problems are.
Well, again, I think what we're talking about is a very difficult subject. Epistemology is a very difficult subject. I'm not saying that I'm an
Not on
expert
this
in
part. Like this part
epistemology.
is universal agreement.
My objection, Tom, my difficulty with your starting point is simply the definitions of existence and of thinking, and that's where I think we differ. I'm not trying to make you look bad. I'm not saying you're dumb, and I'm not saying wait, hold on. And I'm not saying you don't exist. I'm not. That's not what I'm arguing. I'm not arguing that you don't exist. I'm saying that our understanding of ourselves is a complex and difficult process that is not entirely obvious when you really think about it.
So there is no.
So let me finish, and then I'll let you go. And I think that I'm not trying to be difficult or dense or anything. I'm just saying that my own limited finite knowledge and experience and qualia and everything that I've experienced in reality differs from yours, of course. But that when we get down to the brass tacks of ontology and knowledge and epistemology, it is a very difficult subject. It always has been for me. And as a Christian, I find that my bedrock is not finally myself, but I am a contingent being whose existence is dependent upon Jesus. So I don't want to, I want to, offer an olive branch and say, look, I'm not trying to make you look dumb. I'm not trying to play gotcha. That's just my objection, is this idea of what constitutes ontology, existence, and thought. And that's where we disagree. And I'm not trying to make you look bad. I understand what seems to be patently obvious when you say, I think, therefore I am. I understand, experientially what thought and existence is, but hard empirical philosophical discussions about how we think and what we know are very difficult. And so I just want to say, out of respect. Well,
just to interrupt,
well,
there's no controversy in anything I just said. Everyone, 100% of every philosopher and every scientist agrees with everything I just said. Like literally, pretty much every human who isn't a flat earther agrees with what I just said. Most flat earthers agree with what I just said. Like there is universal agreement in academia about what I just said. There is no issue with it at all. So this is the hard part. Is like I use this specifically because there is universal agreement on this. As the starting point. Like there is not an issue. The things you brought up are not an issue at all with anything I said.
Yeah, I mean, if you look into it, I mean, the research on existence, epistemology, ontology, it's not cut and dry. I mean, especially if one is not, a theist. I mean, even if you are a theist, the philosophical theology and the philosophy of existence and ontology are very difficult things.
Yes,
I mean, they are. They're really difficult at some level, and at some level, they're inherently obvious.
So I talk with professionals. I talk with the experts in these fields regularly. None of them at all will ever say what I've just said is an issue. None of them. Like this is not an issue. There are lots of issues with epistemology. There's lots of issues with ontology. They're very complicated fields. What I have said, there is none of them in that. Not a single issue is in that problem. It is the flawless starting point for knowledge. Granted in all philosophy, cogito ergo sum, there is not an issue there.
Well, there's a lot of objection to that as a beginning point for ontology and epistemology. Just read the literature.
I have read the literature multiple times.
If somebody in the comments wants to Google,
No, I have read the literature. I've literally invited the experts in the field on to talk about this. There isn't an issue with that.
I've seen some of your discussions with some Christian philosophers on this, and it seems like you guys do get stuck on this particular issue of philosophical assumptions about ontology.
No, none of them have anything to do with I think therefore I am. There is not an issue there at all. Ontology doesn't even come into it at that point. There is no issue.
No, sure it does.
No,
your very being.
No,
Okay,
like
well,
whether I'm made of material or idealism or dualism, that ontology, what is the fundamental nature of reality, that ontology does not come into the question. It is not a part of the premise.
sure it came out of your being. I mean,
No,
you're using your being to tell your being that you exist.
no. So again, what this constitutes the fundamental ontology of reality, materialism, dualism, idealism, is not in the first premise. It doesn't matter. It is ontology invariant. Now, I exist. Obviously, my existence is a part of ontology, but the fundamental part of reality that you keep asking for isn't at all. It doesn't make a difference. It makes no difference because it's always going to be true regardless of which ontology. So every philosopher agrees with this. This is not an issue. There is no problems here. There is no philosophical issue with anything I just said. It's simply P or not P, law of non-contradiction. Everyone agrees with this. This is the most obvious thing in philosophy, as agreed upon by everyone in philosophy.
No, I don't think your definitions of existence or thinking are that easy. I mean, on the one hand, again, they are it
Well,
seems
I think
intuitively,
so just to
simplistically
clarify,
self-evident. On the other hand, there's a large body of philosophy about what it means to exist.
So the definitions don't matter. It's an experience. I'm experiencing existing.
Yeah,
That
that's
is
where we
the thing.
disagree. I think the definitions do matter
The
because
definitions,
you can't prove that you're experiencing what you
definitions
say you're
are, you don't need to
experiencing.
prove anything. There's no asking for proof in the first premise, so you can't bring that up. That doesn't
Yeah.
matter. It's like apples and oranges. I don't care about apples and oranges. It's not in the first premise. The definition of existing is just the experience of the existing. There is no definition. It is an experience. The definition is just a way to describe that. It's not at all. The definition, the words I use to describe that experience make no difference. It's not going to change the experience.
Oh, so the language does not have any conceptual reality to what your experiences are.
Right. The language cannot stop me
Yeah,
from
that's
experiencing.
where you've lost. That's where there's a disconnect, I think,
Okay, so
because
how can the language?
your language is a very much an integral part of your existence, and you're just saying that you're making up this language to describe that you exist.
Yes. So tell me how my language can start or stop me from existing.
You're defining your existence by language that you yourself have created.
No, the language doesn't do anything. The language, I have an experience of existing, and I just describe it with language. The language is again irrelevant. Does nothing.
But see, that's where there's an intimate connection
Okay, so how
between
so?
your
I keep
language.
asking. You keep saying that. You need to demonstrate how so. How can the language make my existence not existing?
Well, I think we've given several examples in the past about the theoretical cosmologies where there's many.
None of those examples in any way make me not exist.
Well, it calls into question what existence means.
Doesn't in any way call into the question what existence means, because existence is just
Sure,
the
Max, have
quality.
you read Max Tegmark's Mathematical Universe?
Nope,
Have you read that?
none of those in any way change my definition of
In
existence.
the opening of the book, he in one chapter he describes himself an experience he's had on a bicycle, almost getting killed versus not getting killed.
None of those in any way change my experience of existing. It does. They could all be true. They could all be false. Does not in any way change my existence. No,
that's where it's contrary. You can't say they could all be true. They could all be false. That's see, now that's where the definition of existence is very important. You can't say, well, they might all be true or they might all be false, and then tell me that you can't have a false positive about it.
No. Their truth or falsity does not make the statement true or false. So the statement, I think, therefore, is going to be true, regardless whether any of those theories are true or false. Those don't make a difference.
Just unpack the word existence. What's that mean to you?
Qualia.
What is qualia?
Qualia. Period.
To you.
Qualia.
What is that?
It is the thing I'm experiencing. It is literally qualia. That is the only thing it is.
So you're created a word
to describe an experience.
Your experience that comes from your experience. It's very circular, Tom.
No, that's not how circular works. That's a tautology. You're saying the same thing twice. Experience cannot be circular by definition. It's just the thing you experience. So no, that is not circular.
Okay, tautologically, circular, whatever you want to say, you've come up with a word. Listen, Tom.
Words don't affect the argument.
On your existence. You can't demonstrate to me that your qualia is actually real.
Yeah, I this is going nowhere. Like, what you're saying is just gibberish. Like, I've already destroyed your argument completely so many times. Like, the fact that you don't understand this is literally just the basic facts of reality.
I do understand it. I think your definitions of existence are what the problem is. You
I'm
just say
using the
existence.
philosophical definition, qualia.
Is existence.
Yep.
And you can't demonstrate this to be true. You assume it to be true, but you can't
You
demonstrate.
don't need to demonstrate it for it to be true. You don't need to demonstrate things for them to be true. They can be true without them being demonstrated.
Right. So here's an exemption that you have for yourself. You don't have to demonstrate that this is true.
No.
You can assume it's true. But I can't. I have to somehow. I'm burdened with having to demonstrate.
Wrong again. Again, there was no point in the first premise. Does it say demonstrate anything? No point in the first premise does it say you need to demonstrate anything.
Right. So, but then you claim that my starting point produces false positives and therefore is unreliable.
Right.
But you can't do that just from your own starting point. You cannot do that.
Mine cannot produce false positives, so it does.
Well, you can't say your axiom there of your starting point does not have sufficient grounds to tell me that mine is wrong.
Right. It doesn't attempt to. It doesn't even try to.
You have been attempting to do that. You have been telling me that my ontology produces false positives. You've been telling me that simply from your I think, therefore I am.
Oh my God.
You've said that doesn't produce false positives.
So
but then you tell me that mine is insufficient.
No, I have a model. You have a model. My model does not produce false positives. Your model does produce false positives. Nowhere in my model does it say that.
You can't tell me that just from I exist there.
It doesn't. It doesn't say that anywhere in my model. My model doesn't say your model produces false positives. That's not in my model.
You're saying it, Tom. You're saying it.
Yes,
and I'm saying your model hasn't established anything.
Apples exist. Apples exist is also not in my model. My model does not say anything about your model or anyone else's model. That's not part of my model.
You're telling me what my model is. You're telling me my model is wrong.
No, my model says I think, therefore I am, period. It doesn't say anything about your model.
Right, and then you tell me that mine has a false positive. And you,
no. So then we compare the two models. We say, here's my model, here's your model, and then we compare properties to them. None of that is actually in my model. There's not like, in my model requires all of this different stuff in there. Like, no, that's not how models work. Like, it's so bad. Like, this is so obvious. Ridiculous. Like, I don't know how much more simple I can make this. It's so unbelievably simple.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm ready to just call it a day, because that was essentially, there is no greater proof of the falseness of your ideology than that. There's no greater way to show how more wrong it could be.
Okay.
Anyway, if you have any closing remarks, that's fine.
No, I'm fine. Thanks for the chat.
Yep. Thanks for the chat. It was interesting.
All right.
Talk to you later.